The 12 Dates of Christmas. A Christmas on Palmar Island Romance. Written by Susanne Ash. Chapter 1. The causeway bridge stretched ahead of Elena Hart like a ribbon across the salt marsh, its familiar curve both welcoming and daunting in the late afternoon light. She gripped the steering wheel of her rental car a little tighter as Palmar Island came into view, the barrier island's low profile dotted with weathered cottages and maritime forest exactly as she remembered. She was hiding. The thought made her wince as she passed the weathered wooden sign, "Welcome to Palmar Island." Regrouping, she corrected herself firmly, taking a break to figure things out. It sounded better than admitting she'd fled New York with her tail between her legs after her entire life had imploded in spectacular fashion. The December air was crisp when she cracked the window, carrying the scent of salt marsh and pine that made her lungs ache with recognition. She'd forgotten how different the air felt here, clean and sharp in a way that New York's smog-choked atmosphere had never offered. A few other cars shared the narrow road, locals heading home from mainland errands, their easy pace a stark contrast to the frantic energy she'd left behind. Elena envied them that certainty. The causeway morphed into Main Street, the island's main drag, lined with the same weathered shops and restaurants she remembered, though now they were dressed for the holidays. Strings of white lights wound around lampposts and every storefront window glowed with festive displays. It was like stepping into a Christmas card. The kind of scene she used to write about in her travel articles back when she still believed in magic and happy endings. Her phone buzzed from the passenger seat. A text from her sister. Safe trip? Aunt Meredith's cottage, still standing? Elena pulled into the parking lot of Palmar Hardware and feed to respond just arrived. Cottage is perfect. Stop worrying. She didn't mention that she hadn't actually seen the cottage yet, or that her hands were shaking slightly as she turned onto Seashell Lane. She'd been 17 the last time she'd spent more than a weekend on Palmar Island, and she'd left so certain she'd never need to come back for more than holidays and family visits. Funny how life had a way of humbling you. The cottage sat at the end of the lane, exactly as she remembered it. A cozy blue-shingled bungalow with white trim and a wraparound porch that her aunt had always kept cluttered with wind chimes and flowering plants. Now it was decorated with a simple wreath on the door and white lights outlining the roofline, welcoming and peaceful in the fading afternoon light. Elena fumbled with the key her aunt had mailed her, her fingers still stiff from the long drive. After her third attempt, the lock finally gave way and she stepped inside to the familiar scent of lavender and sea salt that meant Aunt Meredith. The cottage felt like a hug. Nothing had changed. It held the same overstuffed furniture and faded florals, the same collection of sea glass catching light on the windowsills, the same row of well-loved books lining the built-in shelves. Elena dropped her bags by the door and sighed. Maybe this hadn't been a mistake after all. She was still standing there taking it all in when a knock came at the door. Elena froze. She hadn't told anyone she was coming except her family, and Aunt Meredith was spending the holidays in Florida with her new boyfriend. Who could possibly? Elena, is that you in there? The voice was deeper than she remembered, weathered by years and salt air, but she'd have known it anywhere. Her heart did a little skip as she opened the door to find Jesse Winslow standing on the porch, a toolbox in one hand and that same crooked smile she remembered from childhood. Jesse. His name came out as barely more than a whisper. He was tall and broader through the shoulders, with the kind of easy confidence that came from years of physical work. His hair was still that dark blonde that had always looked sun-streaked even in winter, though now it was shorter, more practical. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had always seemed to see straight through her, those were exactly the same. "Hey, Ellie." The childhood nickname rolled off his tongue like no time had passed at all. "Meredith asked me to check on the cottage while she's gone. Didn't know you were coming." Last-minute decision, Elena managed, acutely aware that her hair was escaping its braid and her coat was wrinkled from the long drive. She hadn't bothered with makeup that morning either. Not exactly the triumphant homecoming she might have imagined. "I'm house-sitting for a few weeks." Jesse's smile widened, and she caught a glimpse of the boy who used to dare her to jump off the harbor dock with him. Well, look at that. Elena Hart, back on Palmar Island for more than 48 hours. This might be a Christmas miracle. Despite everything, she found herself smiling back. "Don't get too excited. It's temporary. Everything's temporary," he said with a shrug that seemed oddly meaningful. "Doesn't make it less good." They stood there for a moment, taking each other in. Elena tried not to notice how the years had been kind to him. The way his flannel shirt stretched across his chest, the laugh lines around his eyes, the capable hands that had always been good at fixing things. He looked like he belonged here in a way she'd never quite managed, even as a child. So Jesse said, hefting his toolbox, "Mind if I finish what I came to do? Just need to tighten a loose board on the back steps. Won't take 5 minutes." "Of course." She stepped aside to let him through, inhaling the familiar scent of sawdust and soap as he passed. "Can I get you something?" "Coffee? I think Aunt Meredith has some of those cookies you used to like." "The snickerdoodles?" His eyes lit up like he was 12 again. "She still makes those?" "Some things never change," Elena said, surprised by the warmth in her own voice. Jesse paused in the doorway, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "No," he said quietly. "Some things don't." Chapter 2. The screen door creaked as Elena stepped onto the back porch, balancing a tray with 2 fresh cups of coffee and a plate of her aunt's homemade snickerdoodles. Jesse looked up from where he was packing his tools, his heart doing that familiar skip it had been doing around Elena Hart since he was 16 years old. "Thought you might want a proper snack," she said, settling the tray on the small wicker table between 2 chairs. "She still makes the best snickerdoodles on the island," Jesse said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The December air had a bite to it, and steam rose from their mugs in lazy spirals. He watched Elena curl up in one of the chairs, tucking her legs beneath her, and tried not to notice how the soft gray sweater brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "So," she said, taking a sip of coffee, "paramedic and boat tour guide? That's quite a combination." Jesse shrugged, settling into the chair across from her. He could talk about work all day, but what he really wanted was to understand what had brought her home looking so defeated. "The tours are seasonal, mostly holiday lights this time of year, helps pay for the boat maintenance." "You always did love being on the water," Elena said. "Remember when you convinced me to help you build that raft out of driftwood? We made it maybe 50 yards before it fell apart." Jesse couldn't help grinning at the memory. "Hey, the raft was seaworthy. You just panicked when that crab climbed on board." Elena's laughter hit him like sunshine after a storm. "It was huge. And you told me crabs couldn't swim that far from shore." "They can't," Jesse said. "That one was clearly an overachiever." The sound of her laugh made something tight in his chest loosen. This was the Elena he remembered. Quick to smile, ready for adventure, lit up from the inside. The woman who'd walked into the cottage earlier had seemed dimmed somehow, and seeing glimpses of the girl he'd known felt like a gift. "I missed this," she said quietly, and Jesse's heart clenched at the wistfulness in her voice, the simplicity of it. "Just sitting somewhere beautiful with someone who knew me when I was 12 and thought I could save the world with a good story and enough determination." "You still could," Jesse said, meaning every word. He'd followed her career over the years, reading her articles online and feeling proud every time he saw her byline. But Elena's smile faltered, and Jesse saw something fragile flicker across her face. "I'm not so sure about that anymore." The vulnerability in her voice made Jesse want to reach across the space between them and pull her into his arms. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. "What happened, Ellie? Really?" She was quiet for so long Jesse thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and each word felt like a small wound. "Everything fell apart at once," she said. "My relationship, my job, my confidence in my own judgment. Turns out I'm terrible at reading people. Terrible at knowing who to trust." Someone had hurt her, and the protective instinct that had been part of loving Elena Hart since they were kids flared hot and immediate. "He didn't deserve you." "You don't even know what happened," Elena said with a bitter laugh that made Jesse's chest ache. "Don't need to," Jesse said firmly. "Anyone who'd hurt you like that doesn't deserve what you have to offer." Something shifted in Elena's expression, a softness that gave Jesse hope. "You always were too nice, Jesse Winslow." "Not nice," Jesse said. "Just honest." They sat in comfortable silence, and Jesse found himself memorizing the moment. The way the afternoon light caught in Elena's hair, the sound of waves in the distance, the simple pleasure of sharing coffee and cookies with the girl who'd always felt like home to him. "I've been thinking," Elena said suddenly, "maybe I should just give up on dating altogether. Become one of those women who has cats and a really impressive book collection." Jesse nearly choked on his coffee. "You're allergic to cats." "Details," Elena said, waving a hand. "I'll get shots. Or one of those hairless ones." Elena Hart, sworn off men forever, Jesse mused, though the idea made his stomach clench. "I don't buy it." "Why not?" she asked, and there was a challenge in her voice that sparked something competitive in Jesse's chest. "Because," Jesse said, setting down his coffee and leaning forward, "you still believe in love. Real love. the kind that lasts. Elena stared at him, and Jesse could see her weighing his words. What makes you so sure? Because I know you, Jesse said simply. It was the truth. He'd been studying Elena Hart most of his life. You wouldn't be this hurt if you didn't still believe it was out there somewhere. Maybe I used to believe, Elena said quietly, but not anymore. Love is just a myth, something we tell ourselves to make the loneliness bearable. The defeat in her voice broke something in Jesse's chest. This wasn't the Elena who used to dare him to climb higher, dream bigger, believe in impossible things. Someone had taken that from her, and Jesse suddenly knew exactly what he had to do. Prove it, he said. Prove what? That love doesn't exist, that it's not worth believing in. Elena raised an eyebrow, and Jesse caught a glimpse of the girl who'd never backed down from a challenge. How exactly would I do that? Jesse's heart started racing, but he forced himself to sound casual. Let me take you on 12 dates before Christmas. If I can't prove that love, real, lasting, worth it love exists, then I'll personally buy you that hairless cat. Elena blinked at him like he'd just suggested they swim to the mainland. You want to do what? 12 dates, Jesse repeated, surprised by how steady his voice sounded when his pulse was hammering. Christmas is in 3 weeks. That's plenty of time to test your theory. Jesse, that's completely ridiculous, Elena said, but Jesse saw the curiosity in her eyes. We're friends. We've been friends since we were kids. So, Jesse said, though the word friend stung more than he cared to admit. Maybe that's exactly what makes it worth trying. Before Elena could respond, the sound of footsteps on gravel made them both turn. Miss Doris appeared around the corner of the cottage, carrying a covered dish and wearing the kind of knowing smile that made Jesse's cheeks burn. Don't mind me, Miss Doris said cheerfully, just dropping off some chicken pot pie for your first night back, dear. But I couldn't help overhearing this interesting conversation. Jesse watched Elena's cheeks turn pink and felt a surge of gratitude toward the island's unofficial matchmaker. Miss Doris, how long have you been standing there? Long enough to know that Jesse here is making a very smart proposition, Miss Doris said, setting the dish on the porch railing. Her eyes twinkled as she looked between them. Elena, sweetheart, what do you have to lose? Our friendship? Elena said weakly. Pish, Miss Doris said with a wave of her hand. Real friendship can survive anything, including a little romance. And honey, if 12 dates with this sweet boy can't restore your faith in love, then nothing can. Jesse held his breath as Elena looked between him and Miss Doris. He could practically see her weighing the risks, calculating the odds. Come on, Ellie, he thought. Take the chance. 12 dates, Jesse said again, his gray eyes steady on hers. What do you say, Ellie? Elena took a deep breath, and Jesse saw the exact moment she made her decision. This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever agreed to, she said. But fine. 12 dates. Just don't blame me when you realize I'm right about love being a fairy tale. Chapter 3. Elena pulled her wool coat tighter as she waited by the harbor walk entrance, second-guessing her decision for the 10th time in as many minutes. When Jesse had texted that morning asking if she was free for their first official date, she'd almost chickened out. The whole thing still felt surreal. 12 dates with Jesse Winslow, the boy who used to help her catch fireflies in mason jars and build elaborate sandcastles that never quite looked like the pictures in her books. But here she was, watching her breath form little clouds in the crisp December air and wondering what she'd gotten herself into. You look nervous, came Jesse's familiar voice from behind her. Elena turned to find him approaching with 2 steaming cups from the roasted bean, his cheeks already pink from the cold. He'd traded his usual work clothes for dark jeans and a navy peacoat that made his gray eyes look almost silver in the glow of the Christmas lights. Not nervous, Elena said, accepting one of the cups gratefully. The rich scent of chocolate and cinnamon rose from the cocoa, warming her face. Aware that this is slightly insane. Jesse's smile was warm and a little mischievous. The best adventures usually are. They fell into step together, walking slowly along the wooden boardwalk that curved around the harbor. Palmar Island had always gone all out for Christmas, but Elena had forgotten just how magical it could be. Strings of white lights draped from every lamppost and railing, casting dancing reflections on the dark water. Shop windows glowed with festive displays, and the scent of cinnamon and pine drifted from the various cafes and boutiques. I can't believe how much this place lights up, Elena said, pausing to admire a particularly elaborate display outside the island bookstore. It's like something out of a snow globe. Wait until you see the tree lighting tomorrow night, Jesse said. Miss Doris has been coordinating it for 20 years. It's quite the production. Elena sipped her cocoa, letting the warmth spread through her chest. Remember when we used to sneak out here on Christmas Eve? You convinced me Santa would arrive by boat instead of sleigh because of all the water. You believed me for exactly 1 year, Jesse said with a laugh. Then you figured out I was just trying to get you to stay up late with me. I was a gullible kid, Elena said, but she was smiling at the memory. They'd been maybe 8 and 9, huddled together on this same boardwalk in their pajamas under winter coats, whispering about Christmas wishes and making elaborate plans for when they grew up. You were trusting, Jesse corrected gently. There's a difference. Something in his tone made Elena glance at him, but he was looking out at the water, his expression thoughtful. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds their footsteps on the wooden planks and the gentle lapping of waves against the dock. Elena found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. There was something about being here with Jesse that felt like coming home, not just to Palmar Island, but to a version of herself she'd almost forgotten existed. So, Jesse said eventually, scale of 1 to 10, how awkward is this? Elena considered the question seriously. Honestly? About a 3, which is weird because I thought it would be closer to an 8. I'll take a 3, Jesse said. Gives us room for improvement. They paused at the end of the pier, where a small gazebo had been strung with hundreds of tiny white lights. Elena leaned against the railing, looking out at the dark expanse of ocean. A few boats bobbed gently in the harbor, their masts decorated with more lights that swayed hypnotically with the movement of the water. It really is beautiful, she said softly. I forgot how peaceful it could be here. New York didn't have the same charm? Jesse asked, settling beside her. Elena let out a rueful laugh. New York has a lot of things. Peace isn't one of them. She took another sip of cocoa, then found herself continuing. I loved it at first. The energy, the opportunities, the feeling that anything could happen. But after a while, all that possibility just started to feel exhausting. Is that why you came back? He asked. Instead of heading somewhere else? Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the lights dance on the water. Partly. I needed somewhere to think without constantly being reminded of all the ways my life didn't turn out like I planned. Jesse nodded, not pushing for more details. That was another thing she'd forgotten about him. His ability to simply listen without trying to fix everything. What about you? Elena asked. Did you ever think about leaving? Seeing what else was out there? Once, Jesse admitted. A few years after high school, I got accepted to a program in Charlotte, thought about studying engineering. But my grandparents needed help with their health issues, and the island, well, it grew on me. Any regrets? Elena asked, genuinely curious. Jesse was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver back then. Elena's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? But Jesse was already straightening up, his expression shifting back to something lighter. I mean, I probably would have made a terrible engineer anyway. I'm much better with my hands than with blueprints. Elena wanted to push, to ask what he'd really meant, but something in his posture told her the moment had passed. Instead, she finished her cocoa. This was nice, she said, and meant it. Thank you for suggesting it. Date number 1 down, Jesse said with that crooked smile that had always made her stomach flutter. 11 to go. Don't get cocky, Elena warned, but she was smiling too. It's going to take more than pretty lights and good cocoa to convince me that love is anything more than a really persistent delusion. Challenge accepted, Jesse said, offering her his arm as they started back toward shore. But fair warning, I can be pretty persistent myself. As they walked back along the harbor walk, Elena found herself stealing glances at Jesse's profile in the golden glow of the Christmas lights. Maybe this whole 12 dates thing wouldn't be the disaster she'd imagined. Maybe it would just be nice to spend time with someone who remembered when she used to believe in Santa, in magic, and in love. Chapter 4. Elena curled up on her aunt's overstuffed sofa with a cup of tea, rain pattering gently against the cottage windows. The weather had turned gray and drizzly overnight, the kind of December day that invited staying inside with a good book. But instead of reaching for one of the novels lining Aunt Meredith's shelves, Elena found herself drawn to the stack of photo albums on the coffee table. She'd noticed them yesterday but hadn't had the heart to look through them. Photo albums felt dangerous these days. Too many memories of a life that no longer existed, too many reminders of dreams that had crumbled. But something about the quiet afternoon and the lingering warmth from last night's walk with Jesse made her feel brave enough to try. The first album was clearly recent, filled with pictures of Aunt Meredith's travels with her new boyfriend, cruises and beach vacations and dinner dates that made Elena smile despite herself. Her aunt looked genuinely happy, radiant in a way that spoke of second chances and new beginnings. The second album was older, its pages slightly yellowed with age. Elena recognized some of the photos from family holidays over the years. Christmas mornings at the cottage, summer barbecues, Easter egg hunts in the backyard. She was in several of them, looking impossibly young and carefree in ways that made her chest ache. But it was the third album that made her breath catch. The cover was decorated with faded stickers and her aunt's careful handwriting, Elena's Island Summers. Inside were dozens of photos spanning her childhood visits to Palmar Island. They showed her building sandcastles, collecting shells, riding bikes along the sandy paths that crisscrossed the island. And in almost every single one, there was Jesse. Elena turned the pages slowly, watching their friendship unfold in snapshots. There they were at maybe 6 and 7, covered in sand and grinning toothlessly at the camera. A few pages later, they were 10 and 11, proudly displaying a bucket full of hermit crabs they'd captured at low tide. Jesse's hair was white blonde from the summer sun, and Elena's was in the messy braids her aunt had always favored. But it was the photo near the end of the album that made Elena's heart skip. She recognized it immediately, though she hadn't seen it in years. It was from the Christmas she was 15, the last winter before everything started to change. She was standing in front of the island's Christmas tree wearing a sparkly silver scarf that had been her pride and joy that year. Behind her, Jesse was grinning at the camera while giving her bunny ears, his own Santa hat slightly askew. Elena touched the photo gently, remembering that night. They'd been walking home from the tree lighting ceremony high on hot chocolate and Christmas spirit when Aunt Meredith had insisted on taking their picture. Elena had been mortified when she'd realized what Jesse was doing behind her, but looking at the photo now, all she could see was how happy they both looked. How comfortable. How right. There was something in Jesse's expression, caught in the moment when he thought no one was looking, that made Elena's chest tighten. The way he was looking at her, even while making bunny ears, held a tenderness that 15-year-old Elena had been too young and self-conscious to notice. But 32-year-old Elena saw it clearly now. She traced the edge of the photo with her fingertip, remembering how Jesse had walked her home that night, how they'd sat on her aunt's porch steps talking about their plans for the future. Elena had been full of dreams about college and travel and all the places she wanted to go. Jesse had listened with the kind of attention that made her feel like her dreams mattered, like they were possible. What had his dreams been? She tried to remember if she'd even asked. The realization hit her like a small punch to the stomach. She'd been so focused on her own plans, so eager to talk about her future, that she'd never really stopped to consider what Jesse wanted. Had he had dreams beyond Palmar Island? Had he wanted to leave too, but stayed because of family obligations? Because it was easier? Because no one ever asked what he wanted? Elena closed the album and set it carefully on the coffee table, but she couldn't stop thinking about that photograph. About the boy who'd been content to make her laugh, to listen to her dreams, to be her faithful companion through every summer and holiday. The boy who'd apparently been looking at her like she hung the moon, even when she'd been too wrapped up in herself to notice. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Elena's heart did a little skip when she saw Jesse's name. "How's the rainy day treating you? Hope you're staying warm." Elena stared at the message for a long moment, then glanced back at the photo album. 15 years later, and he was still checking on her, still making sure she was okay. "Warm and cozy," she typed back. Going through some of Aunt Meredith's old photo albums, found some pretty embarrassing pictures of us as kids. His response came quickly. "Please tell me it's not the one where I got my head stuck in the beach chair." Elena laughed despite herself. "No, but now I'm going to have to find that one." "Looking forward to date number 2 tomorrow," Jesse wrote. Fair warning, it involves flour and possible disaster. Elena felt something flutter in her chest. Anticipation mixed with something warmer, more complicated. Should I be worried? Probably. But I promise it'll be fun. Chapter 5. Jesse checked his watch for the third time as he and Elena walked into the Island Community Center together, seriously reconsidering his life choices. When he'd signed them up for the annual holiday cookie bake-off, it had sounded like a brilliant idea. It seemed fun, festive, and guaranteed to make Elena laugh. Now, watching serious-looking islanders arrange professional-grade mixers and measuring tools, he was starting to think he might have overestimated his baking abilities and underestimated the competition. "Please tell me you have some secret culinary skills I don't know about," Elena said, accepting a registration packet from the volunteer table. She looked adorable in jeans and a red sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger, more like the girl he remembered. Define secret, Jesse said, scanning the registration form with growing dread. I can make a mean grilled cheese sandwich. And I've never actually set a kitchen on fire. That's not entirely reassuring, Elena said, but she was smiling. What exactly did you sign us up for? Jesse read from the packet. Teams of 2-3 hours to make 3 dozen decorated sugar cookies judged on taste, presentation, and creativity. Winners get a $50 gift certificate to the roasted bean and bragging rights for the year. And the losers? Get to clean up everyone else's mess, Jesse admitted. But hey, how hard can it be? It's cookies. Elena raised an eyebrow. Famous last words. Miss Doris appeared beside them with a clipboard, her face lighting up with the kind of smile that meant she was up to something. There are my favorite contestants, she exclaimed, checking their names off her list. I've got you set up at Station 4, right next to the Harrison twins. They won last year, so you'll have excellent role models. Jesse glanced over at Station 3, where 2 middle-aged women were already laying out ingredients with military precision. One of them had brought what appeared to be a professional pastry bag set. The other had wheeled in an impressive stand mixer that looked like it belonged in a commercial bakery. We're doomed, Elena whispered. Have faith, Jesse said, though he was beginning to share her pessimism. How competitive can a cookie contest be? The answer, it turned out, was very. The moment Miss Doris blew the starting whistle, the community center erupted into organized chaos. Mixers whirred to life, flour clouds rose into the air, and the Harrison twins began what could only be described as a synchronized baking ballet. Jesse and Elena stared at their station, which contained flour, sugar, butter, eggs, vanilla, and a collection of cookie cutters that looked like they'd seen better decades. Okay, Elena said, rolling up her sleeves with determined efficiency. We need a plan. Do you have a recipe? Jesse pulled out his phone and quickly Googled easy sugar cookie recipe. Found one. Says it takes 30 minutes prep time. We have 3 hours, Elena said. That gives us plenty of time for mistakes. They would need it. Their first mistake was not reading the recipe all the way through before starting. Jesse began creaming butter and sugar with wild enthusiasm while Elena measured flour, and they didn't realize until they were elbow deep in the process that they were supposed to cream the butter first, then gradually add the sugar. Instead, they dumped everything together at once, creating a chaotic mess that refused to cooperate. Their second mistake was assuming that cream butter and sugar until light and fluffy was more of a suggestion than a requirement. Jesse's enthusiasm with the ancient hand mixer resulted in butter chunks flying across their workspace and a fine coating of sugar settling over everything within a 3-foot radius. Here, let me try, Elena said, taking the mixer from him, but the ancient appliance had apparently decided it had had enough. With a grinding, mechanical wheeze, it gave up entirely, leaving them with lumpy, barely mixed dough and increasingly desperate expressions. We can fix this, Jesse said, grabbing a wooden spoon. We'll just mix it by hand. With what muscles? Elena asked, trying to stir the stiff mixture. This dough is like concrete. That's when Jesse made mistake number 3, adding a splash of milk to soften the dough. He went overboard, and what had been too stiff dough quickly became too soft to handle. More flour, Elena declared, dumping a generous amount into the bowl. Lots more flour. Jesse watched, mesmerized, as she attacked the mixture with fierce determination, flour dust rising around her like a cloud. There was something captivating about seeing Elena completely absorbed in a task, her usual careful composure replaced by focused intensity. You've got a little. Jesse reached out without thinking, brushing a streak of flour from her cheek with his thumb. Elena went very still, her brown eyes widening as she looked up at him. For a moment, the chaos of the bake-off faded away, and Jessie became acutely aware of how close they were standing, how soft her skin felt under his touch, how her lips were slightly parted in surprise. Flour, he finished lamely, though he didn't step back. Oh, Elena breathed, and Jesse could have sworn he saw something shift in her expression, something warm and uncertain and full of possibility. Elena. Jesse. How's it going over there? Miss Doris's voice cut through the moment like a knife. They sprang apart guiltily, Jesse's hand dropping to his side as Elena spun back to the mixing bowl with suspicious intensity. Great, Elena called back, her voice slightly higher than usual. Just working out some consistency issues. Miss Doris appeared at their station, taking in the flour-dusted workspace, the abandoned broken mixer, and what appeared to be cookie dough stalactites hanging from Elena's hair. I see, she said diplomatically. Well, you certainly look like you're having fun. After Miss Doris moved on, Jesse and Elena worked in relative silence, both carefully avoiding eye contact as they attempted to salvage their dough. By some miracle, They managed to get it to a rollable consistency and began cutting out shapes. But once they baked, they turned into lopsided Christmas trees, stars that looked more like abstract art, and gingerbread people with distinctly questionable proportions. Okay, these aren't winning any beauty contests, Elena said, taking their first batch out of the oven. They're rustic. Rustic is good, Jesse agreed, though privately he thought their cookies looked like they'd been made by particularly enthusiastic 5-year-olds. Rustic is charming. They spent the remaining time attempting to decorate their cooled cookies with royal icing that refused to cooperate. Elena had somehow gotten some in her hair, and Jesse was fairly certain he had red food coloring permanently embedded under his fingernails. "This is supposed to be a tree," Elena said, holding up a cookie that looked vaguely botanical if you squinted. "And this is definitely a reindeer," Jesse said, displaying his own creation, which bore a passing resemblance to a 4-legged creature if you ignored the extra limbs. Elena looked at his cookie, then at hers, and burst into laughter. Not polite, restrained laughter, but the kind of deep, helpless giggling that made her double over and clutch her sides. "We're terrible at this," she gasped between laughs. "These are the worst cookies in the history of cookies." Jesse couldn't help joining in, their laughter drawing curious glances from the more serious competitors around them. "Hey, they might taste good." Elena broke off a piece of one of their trees and took a tentative bite. Her expression was comical. "They taste like flour and regret, with just a hint of desperation," Jesse added, trying his own cookie. They were still laughing when Miss Doris announced time was up. Looking around at the other stations with their perfectly decorated masterpieces and professional presentations, Jesse felt a moment of embarrassment. Their cookies looked like a craft project gone wrong. But then he glanced at Elena, flour-dusted and icing-streaked and grinning like she hadn't grinned in years, and he realized he didn't care about winning. This was better than winning. "Well," Elena said, surveying their disaster of a workspace, "that was certainly an experience." "Good experience or bad experience?" Jesse asked, though her smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Surprisingly good," Elena admitted, "even if we did just humiliate ourselves in front of the entire island." "Hey, at least we'll be memorable," Jesse said. "That's one word for it," Elena laughed. As they began cleaning up their station, Jesse caught Elena stealing glances at him, something thoughtful and complicated in her expression. The moment when he'd touched her face kept replaying in his mind, the way she'd looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. Maybe 12 dates wouldn't be enough time to prove what he wanted to prove. But judging by the way Elena was smiling at him right now, flour in her hair and icing on her sweater, it might be exactly enough time for her to remember who they used to be together. Chapter 6. The Palmar Island Library was exactly as Elena remembered it. A cozy brick building with tall windows and the kind of hushed atmosphere that made even whispered conversations feel reverent. She'd volunteered to help with the holiday book display, partly because she missed being around books, and partly because she needed something to do with her hands while her mind processed yesterday's baking disaster, and that moment when Jessie had brushed flour from her cheek. Elena arranged a collection of Christmas mysteries on the featured display table, trying not to think about how her skin had tingled where he'd touched her, or how his gray eyes had gone soft and serious in that split second before Miss Doris had interrupted them. She was here to organize books, not to analyze every fleeting moment of what was supposed to be a simple, ridiculous bet about love. The bell above the library door chimed, and Elena looked up to see the woman in question bustling in with her characteristic energy, a wicker basket tucked under one arm. "Elena, dear," Miss Doris exclaimed, though she lowered her voice appropriately for the library setting. "How lovely to see you here. I was hoping to find a good holiday mystery to curl up with tonight." "Perfect timing," Elena said, gesturing to the display she'd been arranging. "I just finished setting up the Christmas collection. There's a new Agatha Christie-style one set in a snowed-in English village and a cozy one about a baker who solves crimes during the holidays." Miss Doris examined the books with interest, but Elena got the distinct impression that reading material wasn't the real reason for her visit. There was something too knowing in the older woman's smile, too purposeful in the way she lingered by the display table. "How is volunteering treating you?" Miss Doris asked, selecting the Baker mystery and turning it over to read the back cover. "It's nice," Elena said honestly. "Peaceful. I forgot how much I missed being around books." "You always were a reader," Miss Doris said. "Even as a little girl, you'd come in here with Jessie and disappear into the children's section for hours. He'd be looking at adventure stories, and you'd be reading fairy tales." Elena felt her cheeks warm at the mention of Jessie. "We were good friends." "Still are, from what I can see," Miss Doris said with a gentle smile, "though perhaps something more is developing?" Elena busied herself straightening book spines that didn't need straightening. We're reconnecting, catching up on old times. Miss Doris said, and somehow she managed to pack a world of meaning into that single sound. She moved closer to the display, running her fingers along the book covers with the kind of care that suggested she truly loved stories. You know, dear, I've been reading romances for 70 years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that some stories take a few chapters to get right. Doesn't mean they don't have a happy ending. Elena's hands stilled on the books. Miss Doris, I'm not meddling, Miss Doris said quickly, though her twinkling eyes suggested she absolutely was. Just observing. That boy has been carrying a torch for you since you were teenagers, whether you knew it or not. And yesterday at the bake-off, well, it was clear to anyone with eyes that the feeling might be mutual. Elena's heart skipped a beat. Jesse and I are just friends. We've always been just friends. Sometimes the best love stories start with friendship, Miss Doris said gently. Sometimes they take years to unfold. Sometimes we have to leave and come back again before we can see what was right in front of us all along. Elena opened her mouth to protest, but Miss Doris was already heading toward the checkout desk with her selected mystery. Enjoy your afternoon, dear, Miss Doris called over her shoulder. And don't be afraid to turn the page when you're ready for the next chapter. Elena stood among the holiday books for a long moment after Miss Doris left, the older woman's words echoing in her mind. Some stories take a few chapters to get right. Was that what this was? The next chapter in a story that had started when she was 15 and wearing a sparkly scarf, standing beside a boy who made bunny ears behind her head? She shook her head and returned to her work, processing returned books and helping the few patrons who wandered in during the quiet afternoon. It wasn't until she was checking in a stack of romance novels that she found it, a small piece of paper tucked between the pages of a book about second chances. Elena unfolded the note, recognizing Miss Doris's careful handwriting immediately. Sometimes the safest place to land is the one you never left. Elena stared at the note for a long time, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Miss Doris had clearly planned this, the seemingly casual visit, the gentle words about love stories and happy endings, and now this message hidden where only Elena would find it. She thought about the cottage where she was staying, about the photo albums full of memories, about Jesse walking beside her on the harbor walk with Coco warming their hands. She thought about how easy it had been to laugh with him yesterday, flower-covered and ridiculous, feeling more like herself than she had in months. Was this home? Had it always been home, waiting quietly for her to realize it? Chapter 7. Jesse checked the weather forecast one more time as he prepared the boat for evening departure. Perfect conditions. Calm seas, clear skies, and almost no wind that would make the December air feel even colder. He'd been running holiday light tours for 3 years now, but tonight felt different. Tonight wasn't about showing tourists the island's Christmas displays from the water. Tonight was about sharing something he loved with the one person whose opinion had always mattered most. The seabird bobbed gently at her mooring, a 24-foot center console that Jesse had restored himself over 2 summers. She wasn't fancy, but she was reliable and comfortable, with cushioned seating and a small cabin for gear. He'd strung white lights along the railings for the holiday tours, and they cast a warm glow over the water as dusk settled over the harbor. Elena appeared at the dock right on time, wrapped in a thick coat and carrying what looked like a thermos. She paused at the edge of the pier, studying the boat with an expression that was half anticipation, half nervousness. "She's beautiful," Elena said as Jesse helped her aboard. "How long have you had her?" "About 5 years," Jesse said, pleased by the genuine admiration in her voice. "Bought her as a project and spent way too many weekends getting her seaworthy. But she's worth it." Elena settled onto the bench seat as Jesse started the engine, the low rumble mixing with the gentle lap of waves against the hull. The harbor was quiet at this hour, most of the day boats already secured for the night and the fishing fleet not due back until later. "So what exactly does a holiday light tour involve?" Elena asked, pulling her coat tighter against the evening chill. "You'll see," Jesse said with a grin, easing the boat away from the dock. "But fair warning, it's not exactly a high-speed adventure. More like a floating meditation with Christmas lights." As they cleared the harbor and entered the open water, Jesse felt the familiar sense of peace that always came with being on the ocean. The boat moved smoothly through the gentle swells, and the last traces of sunset painted the sky in soft pinks and purples. Elena sat quietly beside him, her face turned toward the horizon, and Jesse found himself stealing glances at her profile in the fading light. "It's so quiet out here," Elena said after a while. "In New York, there's always noise, traffic, sirens, construction, people. I'd forgotten what actual silence sounds like." That's what I love about it, Jesse said, adjusting their course to follow the island's coastline. Out here, you can actually hear yourself think. Dangerous habit, Elena said with a rueful smile. Thinking. Jesse wanted to ask what she was thinking about, but something in her tone suggested she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he pointed toward the shore where the first Christmas lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. There, he said. That's the old Sutton place. They go completely overboard every year. Synchronized lights, inflatable decorations, the whole 9 yards. Elena leaned forward to get a better look, and Jesse slowed the boat so they could appreciate the elaborate display. From the water, the lights looked magical, reflecting off the dark surface and creating double images that danced with the gentle movement of the waves. It's like seeing it from a completely different world, Elena said softly. Everything looks so peaceful from out here. Jesse guided the boat along the coastline, pointing out various houses and their unique holiday decorations. There was the cottage with simple white lights outlining every window and roofline, the beach house with a 20-foot inflatable Santa, and the historic home where the owners had recreated a Victorian Christmas scene complete with carriages and carolers. But it was when they reached the island's north point that the real magic began. Jesse cut the engine and let the boat drift, and suddenly the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water and the distant cry of a night bird. "Look up," Jesse said quietly. Elena tilted her head back, and Jesse heard her soft intake of breath. Away from the shore lights, the stars were brilliant, scattered across the dark sky like diamonds on velvet. The water was so calm it acted like a mirror, reflecting the stars and creating the illusion that they were floating in space. "Oh my goodness," Elena whispered. "I haven't seen stars like this in years." Jesse watched her face in the starlight, noting the way her eyes had gone wide with wonder. This was the Elena he remembered from childhood, the girl who could find magic in tide pools and shooting stars, who believed the world was full of beautiful secrets waiting to be discovered. "Light pollution in the city hides most of them," Jesse said. "Out here you can see the Milky Way on a really clear night." They sat in comfortable silence, the boat rocking gently as they drifted with the current. Elena had unconsciously shifted closer to him on the bench seat, and Jesse could smell the faint scent of her shampoo mixed with the salt air. The December night was getting cold, and he could see her shivering slightly despite her heavy coat. "There," Elena said suddenly, pointing toward the eastern horizon. "A shooting star." Jesse followed her gaze and caught the brief streak of light as it arced across the sky. "Make a wish," he said automatically, the words carrying him back to childhood camping trips when his grandmother had taught him to watch for falling stars. "I'm 32 years old," Elena said with a laugh. "I don't believe in wishing on stars anymore." "Humor me," Jesse said. "What's the worst that could happen?" Elena was quiet for a moment, her eyes still fixed on the sky. "Okay," she said finally. "But I'm not telling you what I wished for." "Wouldn't want you to," Jesse said, though he found himself desperately curious about what Elena Hart would wish for on a star above the waters of home. Without thinking, Elena leaned into his shoulder, seeking warmth in the cold night air. Her weight was comfortable against his side, and Jesse held perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the spell. This felt like something he'd been waiting for his entire life. Elena beside him under the stars, peaceful and unguarded in a way she hadn't been since she'd returned to the island. "I forgot how beautiful it could be here," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the gentle sounds of the water. "How simple things could be." "Simple's not always a bad thing," Jesse said, though his heart was beating so hard he was surprised she couldn't hear it. "No," Elena agreed. "It's not." They stayed like that for a long time, drifting under the stars with the holiday lights of Palmar Island twinkling in the distance. Jesse memorized every detail. The weight of Elena's head against his shoulder, the way the starlight caught in her hair, the soft sound of her breathing as she relaxed completely for what might have been the first time since she'd come home. When a fishing boat's distant horn reminded them they weren't alone on the water, Elena straightened up, and Jesse immediately missed her warmth. "We should probably head back," she said, though she sounded reluctant. "It's getting cold." Jesse started the engine and turned the boat toward home, but he drove slowly, wanting to stretch out these perfect moments as long as possible. Elena remained quiet beside him, and he wondered if she was feeling the same reluctance to let the evening end. As they approached the harbor, Elena turned to him with a smile that was soft and genuine and completely unguarded. "Thank you," she said. "That was exactly what I needed." "Anytime," Jesse said, meaning it completely. The boat's here whenever you want to escape for a while. As he helped her onto the dock, their hands touched briefly, and Jesse felt that same electric connection he'd experienced when he'd brushed flour from her cheek. Elena felt it too. He could see it in the way her eyes widened slightly, the way she didn't immediately pull away. But then she stepped back, wrapping her coat more tightly around herself against the cold night air. "Good night, Jesse," she said softly. "Good night, Ellie." Jesse watched her walk away, her figure disappearing into the shadows beyond the harbor lights. He stayed on the boat for a while longer, securing lines and checking equipment, but really just replaying every moment of the evening. 2 dates down, 10 to go. And for the first time since this whole crazy bet had started, Jesse was beginning to think he might actually have a chance. Elena had leaned into him under the stars, had let her guard down in a way that felt like trust, like possibility. Chapter 8. Elena stared at her phone screen for the third time in 10 minutes, reading Jesse's text message and trying to decipher some hidden meaning in the words. "Thanks for coming out on the boat last night. Hope you enjoyed it." It was perfectly polite, perfectly normal, and perfectly unlike the easy warmth that had characterized their interactions since she'd been back on the island. There were no teasing comments, no casual invitation to grab coffee, no hint of the man who had sat beside her under the stars just 12 hours ago. She set the phone down on her aunt's kitchen table and picked up her coffee mug, trying to convince herself she was overthinking things. Maybe Jesse was just busy. Maybe he had a work emergency or an early shift at the ambulance station. Maybe she was reading too much into a simple text message. But she couldn't shake the memory of how he'd gone quiet when she'd straightened up from his shoulder last night, how his smile had seemed forced as he'd helped her off the boat. Had she crossed some invisible line, made things awkward by leaning into him like that? Elena groaned and put her head in her hands. This was exactly why she didn't do relationships anymore. She was terrible at reading signals, at knowing when she was wanted and when she was just imagining things. With John, she'd spent months convinced everything was perfect while he was apparently finding comfort in someone else's arms. How could she trust her own judgment about anything romantic? The house felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in with her swirling thoughts. Elena grabbed her jacket and headed out for a walk, hoping the December air would clear her head. Main Street was busy for a weekday morning with islanders running errands and a few early holiday tourists browsing the shop windows. Elena nodded to a couple of familiar faces from her childhood, people who remembered her as Meredith's niece, but she kept walking, not in the mood for small talk. She was passing Palmar Hardware and Feed when she spotted Jesse's truck in the parking lot. Elena slowed her steps, her heart doing something complicated at the sight of the familiar vehicle. Through the store's large windows, she could see Jesse talking to someone at the counter, his expression serious as he gestured toward what looked like a work order. He looked perfectly normal, not distant or uncomfortable or any of the things she'd been imagining. Just Jesse, handling whatever business had brought him to the hardware store. Elena was about to continue walking when Jesse turned toward the window, and their eyes met through the glass. For a split second, his expression brightened with what looked like genuine pleasure at seeing her. But then something shifted, a subtle closing off that made Elena's stomach clench with uncertainty. Jesse raised his hand in a brief wave, then turned back to his conversation with the clerk. Elena stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, feeling foolish and dismissed in equal measure before continuing her walk toward the beach. The ocean was gray and choppy, matching her mood perfectly. Elena found a piece of driftwood to sit on and pulled her jacket tighter against the wind, watching the waves crash against the shore with more force than they'd had last night on Jesse's boat. Maybe this whole 12 dates thing had been a mistake from the beginning. Maybe she'd been right to swear off romance and stick to her plan of becoming a hermit with good books and a hairless cat. At least books didn't send mixed signals or make her second-guess every interaction. But even as she thought it, Elena knew she was being unfair. Jesse hadn't actually done anything wrong. He'd sent a polite text message and waved when he saw her. That was normal human behavior, not grounds for assuming he regretted their evening together. The problem wasn't Jesse. The problem was her own damaged ability to trust her instincts when it came to matters of the heart. Elena pulled out her phone and stared at Jesse's message again. Maybe she should respond. Keep things light and casual, let him know she'd enjoyed the boat tour without reading too much into the evening. That's what a normal, emotionally healthy person would do. "It was beautiful," she typed. "Thank you for sharing it with me." She hit send before she could overthink it, then immediately regretted not saying more. Or saying less. Or saying something completely different. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. "Glad you had a good time. Talk soon." Elena stared at the response, her heart sinking. Talk soon was what you said to acquaintances, not to someone you'd shared a magical evening with under the stars. It was polite dismissal dressed up as future possibility. She was definitely overthinking this. She had to be. But the alternative that Jesse was pulling back, that she'd misread the connection between them, felt too familiar, too much like the slow, painful realization that John had been checking out of their relationship long before she'd caught him with his coworker. Elena shoved her phone back in her pocket and stood up, brushing sand off her jeans. She had better things to do than dissect text messages like a teenager with her first crush. She was a grown woman with real problems to solve, like figuring out what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. But as she walked back toward her aunt's place, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she'd somehow managed to ruin something beautiful before it had even really begun. And the worst part was, she wasn't even sure what she'd done wrong. Maybe that was the real problem. Maybe she'd been broken by her past experiences, left unable to trust the good things when they appeared in her life. Maybe Jesse wasn't pulling away at all. Maybe she was just so used to disappointment that she was creating problems where none existed. Elena paused at the gate, looking back toward town where Jesse's truck was still parked outside the hardware store. She could walk back, go inside, and ask him directly if everything was okay between them, clear the air and stop the spiral of doubt before it consumed her completely. But what if she was right? What if he was having second thoughts about their bet, about spending time with her? What if she'd imagined the connection she'd felt last night, the way he'd seemed content to have her leaning against him under the stars? Elena sighed and went inside, closing the door on both her doubts and her courage. 3 dates down, 9 to go. Assuming Jesse still wanted to continue their ridiculous experiment in proving love existed, she was beginning to think the only thing they were proving was that she was exactly as hopeless at relationships as she'd feared. Chapter 9. Jesse adjusted the ring toss game for the 3rd time, trying to find the perfect distance that would challenge the kids without making them frustrated. The Palmar Island Elementary School's holiday fair was in full swing, with families wandering between game booths, craft stations, and food tables scattered around the gymnasium. The air buzzed with excitement and the occasional sugar-fueled shriek of delight. He'd volunteered for this event every year since moving back to the island, but this time felt different. This time Elena was here too, manning the book fair table across the gym, and Jesse couldn't stop stealing glances in her direction. They'd barely talked since the boat tour 2 nights ago, and Jesse was kicking himself for how he'd handled things. The moment Elena had leaned into him under the stars, every protective instinct he'd developed over the years had kicked in. She was vulnerable, recently heartbroken, and the last thing she needed was him pushing for something she wasn't ready for. So he'd pulled back, kept his responses polite and brief, given her space to figure out what she wanted without pressure from him. It seemed like the right thing to do, but judging by the way Elena had looked at him through the hardware store window yesterday, confused and maybe a little hurt, he was starting to think he'd miscalculated. "Mr. Jesse, Mr. Jesse." A small voice pulled him from his thoughts. 6-year-old Emma Kessler was tugging on his sleeve, her dark eyes bright with excitement. "Can I try the rings again? I almost got one last time." "Of course you can," Jesse said, crouching down to her level and handing her 3 rings. "Remember what I told you about following through with your throw?" While Emma concentrated on her toss, Jesse's attention drifted back to Elena. She was helping a 3rd grader select a picture book, her face animated as she described the story. Even from across the crowded gym, Jesse could see the genuine enthusiasm in her expression. "I got one." Emma's triumphant shout brought Jesse's focus back. Sure enough, one of her rings had landed perfectly around a bottle. "Excellent work," Jesse said, giving her a high five. "Pick out any prize from the small section." Emma selected a small stuffed snowman and hugged it to her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Jesse. I'm going to show Miss Elena." Before Jesse could respond, Emma was racing across the gym toward the book table. Jesse watched as Elena looked up from helping another child, her face breaking into a genuine smile when she saw Emma approaching. Miss Elena, look what I won." Emma held up her snowman proudly. "That's wonderful," Elena said, and Jesse could hear the warmth in her voice even from his station. "You must have worked really hard for that." "Mr. Jesse helped me," Emma said. "He's really nice. Are you his girlfriend?" Jesse felt his cheeks burn as several nearby parents turned to look between him and Elena with obvious interest. Elena's cheeks had turned pink, but she handled the question with grace. "Mr. Jesse and I are old friends," she said gently. "We've known each other since we were kids, just like you and your friends." "Oh," Emma said, clearly processing this information. Well, you should be his girlfriend. You're both really nice. Several parents nearby chuckled, and Jesse wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. Elena looked like she wanted to disappear too, but she managed to keep her composure. That's very sweet of you to say, Elena told Emma. Now, did you want to look at any books while you're here? Emma was easily distracted by the promise of stories, and Jesse tried to focus on his own duties. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in that brief, awkward exchange. The afternoon continued with its steady stream of activities. During a brief lull, 8-year-old Eric Thompson approached Jesse with a piece of construction paper and a serious expression. "Mr. Jesse," Eric said, "I drew you a picture." Jesse accepted the artwork, expecting the usual stick figure drawing. Instead, he found himself looking at a surprisingly detailed crayon drawing of the holiday fair. There was the gym with its decorations, the various game booths, and in the center, 2 figures. They were standing close together, both smiling, with a group of children around them. "This is really good, Eric," Jesse said, studying the picture. "You included so many details." "That's you and Miss Elena," Eric said, pointing to the 2 central figures. "You look happy together. My mom says happy people should stay together." Jesse felt something tight in his chest as he looked at the innocent drawing. Through a child's eyes, he and Elena looked like they belonged together, like they were already a unit. It was both touching and heartbreaking. "Thank you for this," Jesse said, carefully rolling up the artwork. "I'll treasure it." As the fair began winding down, Jesse found himself helping Elena pack up the book table. They worked together efficiently, but the easy conversation from their first few dates seemed to have evaporated. "Good turnout today," Elena said, breaking the awkward silence. "Yeah, the kids seem to have fun," Jesse replied, then winced at how stilted he sounded. 4 dates down, 8 to go, and Jesse was beginning to wonder if giving Elena space was the right strategy or if he was just making everything more complicated than it needed to be. Chapter 10. Elena curled up on her aunt's sofa with a cup of tea, her laptop balanced on her knees as she waited for her video call to connect. The cottage felt especially quiet tonight, with only the distant rhythm of waves against the shore. Sarah's face appeared on the screen, bright and familiar despite the miles between New York and Palmar Island. Her former colleague looked exactly the same. Auburn hair in a sleek ponytail, designer glasses, and perfectly applied makeup that Elena had given up attempting weeks ago. "There she is," Sarah exclaimed. "My mysterious friend who disappeared to a tropical island and went radio silent." "It's not tropical," Elena said with a laugh. "It's South Carolina in December. I'm actually wearing a sweater." "Still sounds more exotic than my Tuesday night in Manhattan," Sarah said. "So catch me up. How's the hermit life? Have you started talking to coconuts?" Elena smiled despite herself. "No coconuts, but I have been volunteering at the library, so I'm not completely feral yet." "Good to know," Sarah said, then leaned forward with the expression Elena knew meant she was about to probe deeper. "Speaking of human contact, have you met anyone interesting? Please tell me you're not actually planning to become a cat lady." Elena felt her cheeks warm, and Sarah's eyes sharpened immediately. "Oh my goodness, you have met someone," Sarah practically squealed. "Spill. Everything. Now." "It's not what you think," Elena said quickly. "It's an old friend, someone I knew growing up." "Uh-huh," Sarah said skeptically. "And this old friend has you blushing because—" Elena sighed. There was no point hiding anything from Sarah. "His name is Jesse. We've been spending time together, but it's complicated." "Complicated how?" "He's perfect, Sarah. Kind and steady and funny, and he knows me better than almost anyone. But we're friends. We've always been friends, and I don't think he sees me as anything more." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Have you asked him?" "It's not that simple. We made this ridiculous bet. 12 dates before Christmas to prove that love exists. But it's just a game to him, a way to help me get my faith back after John." "Wait," Sarah said, holding up her hands. "He asked you on 12 dates? And you think he doesn't see you romantically?" "It's not romantic," Elena protested. "It's friendly. We're trying to prove a point." Sarah stared at her for a long moment, then shook her head. "Elena, for someone who used to write about human nature for a living, you are remarkably obtuse about your own life." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means no man asks a woman on 12 dates just to make a philosophical point," Sarah said firmly. "Tell me about these dates." Elena found herself describing the harbor walk, the cookie bake-off, the boat tour under the stars. As she talked, she could see Sarah's expression growing more knowing. And during this boat tour, Sarah said, "Did anything happen?" Elena's cheeks burned. "I might have leaned against his shoulder, but it was cold and I was just trying to stay warm." "Right," Sarah said dryly. "And how did he react?" "He seemed okay with it at the time, but afterward he's been distant. Polite but distant. I think I made him uncomfortable." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Or you scared him. In a good way." "What do you mean?" "Think about it from his perspective. He's probably been half in love with you for years. Then you come back, swearing off love, and he sees his chance to show you what you've been missing. But the moment things start to feel real, he panics because suddenly it's not a game anymore." Elena stared at her friend, Sarah's words echoing in her mind. "You think he has feelings for me?" "I think you both have feelings for each other, and you're both too scared to admit it," Sarah said gently. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. The idea that Jesse might actually want her felt too big and too terrifying to fully accept. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted. "What if I'm wrong? What if I'm reading too much into everything again?" "He isn't John," Sarah said firmly. "This Jesse guy sounds like he actually cares about your well-being. You deserve to be happy, Elena. You deserve to be loved by someone who sees how amazing you are." After they hung up, Elena sat in the quiet cottage for a long time, Sarah's words playing on repeat. She thought about Jesse's expression when he'd brushed flour from her cheek, the way he'd looked at her on the boat, the careful distance he'd maintained since then. What if Sarah was right? What if Jesse was pulling back not because he wasn't interested, but because he was too interested? Elena pulled out her phone and started to type a message, then deleted it. Started again, then deleted that too. What was she supposed to say? Chapter 11. Jesse stared down at the empty snow globe in his hands, trying to pretend he was focused on selecting the perfect miniature decorations when really he was stealing glances at Elena across the craft booth table. The Palmar Island Christmas market was in full swing around them, with families strolling between vendor booths and the cheerful sounds of holiday music mixing with children's laughter. But Jesse felt like he and Elena existed in their own awkward bubble of polite distance. He'd been kicking himself for 3 days now, ever since the elementary school fair. For the way Emma had asked if Elena was his girlfriend and the picture Eric had drawn of them. It had all felt too real, too much like something he wanted desperately but couldn't let himself believe was possible. So he'd retreated again, and now Elena was being carefully polite in return. "What are you putting in yours?" Elena asked, holding up a tiny ceramic Christmas tree. Her voice was friendly enough, but there was a cautiousness to it that made Jesse's chest ache. "Still deciding," Jesse said, though he'd been holding the same miniature reindeer for the past 10 minutes. "There are a lot of options." Elena nodded and went back to arranging her decorations. She'd chosen a winter scene with tiny evergreen trees, a small snowman, and what looked like a miniature park bench. Jesse watched her work with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, her dark hair falling forward to hide her expression. Miss Doris appeared at their table with a pitcher of water to fill their snow globe bases. "How's everyone doing over here? Having fun with your winter wonderlands?" "It's harder than it looks," Elena said, adjusting one of her trees for the 3rd time. "Getting everything to look right inside the sphere." "The trick is not to overthink it," Miss Doris said with a knowing smile. "Sometimes the most beautiful things happen when we stop trying to control every detail." Jesse caught the meaningful look Miss Doris shot between him and Elena, and he felt his cheeks warm. The island's unofficial matchmaker was about as subtle as a foghorn. "What about wishes?" asked Betty Harrison from the next table, looking up from her own elaborate snow globe village. "I heard you're supposed to make a wish when you seal them up." "Oh yes," Miss Doris said, clasping her hands together. "That's the most important part. The wish is what gives the snow globe its magic." Jesse glanced at Elena, who was now looking anywhere but at him. Making wishes felt dangerous when the thing he wanted most was sitting 3 feet away, carefully avoiding eye contact. "What kind of wishes?" Elena asked quietly. "Whatever your heart most wants," Miss Doris said simply. "Christmas wishes are the most powerful kind, you know." They worked in relative silence after that, each focused on their own miniature world. Around them, the Christmas market hummed with activity. The scent of kettle corn and hot cider drifted from nearby booths. Families were browsing handmade ornaments, children tugging their parents toward the face-painting station. Jesse finally settled on his decorations. The the tiny reindeer, a small cabin, and a park bench similar to the one Elena had chosen. It wasn't particularly creative, but something about the scene felt right. "Time to add the water and seal them up," announced Lori, the art instructor from the community center who was running the craft booth. "Don't forget to make your wishes." Jesse watched Elena carefully pour water into her globe, her movements precise and thoughtful. She screwed on the top with the same deliberate care, then held the finished product up to the light. When she shook it gently, artificial snow swirled around her tiny winter scene like magic. "Beautiful," Jesse said, meaning it. Elena looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there. "Thanks, yours too." Jesse looked down at his own snow globe, the reindeer and cabin swimming in swirling white. He hadn't made his wish yet. Couldn't quite bring himself to put into words what he wanted most. "So," Elena said, setting her globe carefully on the table, "what did you wish for?" The question hit Jesse like a punch to the chest. He could feel Miss Doris and several other crafters listening with obvious interest, but all he could focus on was Elena's brown eyes watching him with something that might have been hope. "That's between me and the snow globe," Jesse said finally, forcing a smile he didn't feel. Elena's expression shuddered slightly. "Of course. Wishes are supposed to be secret." Jesse wanted to take the words back, to tell her everything he'd been thinking and feeling for the past week. But with half the market crowd nearby and Elena's walls firmly back in place, he couldn't find the courage. They packed up their supplies as the craft booth began closing for the evening. Elena wrapped her snow globe in tissue paper, handling it like something precious. "Well," she said as they gathered their coats, "that was fun. Thanks for suggesting it." "Sure," Jesse said, though the evening felt like anything but a success. "See you soon?" "Of course," Elena said, but she was already moving toward the market's exit. "Good night, Jesse." Jesse watched her leave, then looked down at his own snow globe. He shook it gently, watching the artificial snow swirl around the tiny reindeer and cabin. Around him, vendors were packing up their booths and families were heading home with their market treasures, but Jesse felt frozen in place. "I wish Elena could see that she's already home," he thought finally, the words forming in his mind as clearly as if he'd spoken them aloud. But wishes made to snow globes felt about as effective as throwing pennies in a fountain. And Jesse was starting to think that 12 dates might not be enough time to convince Elena of anything, especially when he couldn't even convince himself to be honest about what he really wanted. He tucked the snow globe carefully into his jacket pocket and headed toward his truck. 5 dates down, 7 to go. And he was no closer to breaking through Elena's walls than he'd been when this whole crazy bet started. Maybe it was time to stop being so careful with her heart and start being honest about his own. Chapter 12. Elena was reshelving returned books when Miss Doris arrived at the library with a cardboard box that looked like it had seen better days. The older woman struggled slightly with the weight of it, and Elena hurried over to help. "What's all this?" Elena asked, taking one end of the box and helping Miss Doris set it on the circulation desk. "Donations for the holiday history display," Miss Doris said, brushing dust off her hands. "I put out the word that we were looking for old Christmas photos, school programs, that sort of thing. You'd be amazed what people have tucked away in their attics." Elena peered into the box, which was filled with manila folders, photo albums, and loose papers. "This is wonderful. The display is really coming together." "I thought you might enjoy going through these," Miss Doris said with one of her knowing smiles. "There are some real treasures in there. I'll leave you to sort through everything." After Miss Doris left, Elena carried the box to one of the reading tables and began pulling out items. There were black and white photos of Christmas pageants from the 1960s, faded programs from holiday concerts, and even some handwritten recipes for traditional Christmas cookies that had been contributed by longtime island families. It was like holding pieces of Palmar Island's history in her hands. Elena was sorting photos by decade when she found a manila folder labeled Palmar Island High School Holiday Memories. Inside were school newspapers, concert programs, and what looked like student assignments from various Christmas-themed projects over the years. She flipped through the papers, smiling at the earnest essays about favorite holiday traditions and memories. Most were typed on old typewriters or early computers, but some were handwritten in the careful script of teenagers trying to make a good impression. That's when she found it. The assignment was titled, "Describe Your Perfect Christmas" at the top, written in blue ink in handwriting she recognized immediately, even though it had been 15 years since she'd seen it. The paper was unsigned, but Elena knew without a doubt that Jesse had written it. Her heart started beating faster as she read, "My perfect Christmas wouldn't be about the presents or the fancy dinner or even the snow, which we never get here anyway. It would be about waking up next to someone who feels like home, someone who laughs at my terrible jokes and doesn't mind that I burn the pancakes on Christmas morning. We'd drink coffee in our pajamas, and I would watch her face light up when she opens the one gift I actually managed to pick out perfectly. Later, we'd walk on the beach and collect shells, just because she likes the way they look in jars on the windowsill. It would be simple and perfect and real. The best part wouldn't be any single moment, but the feeling that this is exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly the person I'm supposed to be with. That this is what home actually means." Elena read the assignment twice, her chest tightening with each word. The paper was dated from their senior year, which meant Jesse had written this when they were 18, right before she'd left for college and he'd stayed behind. Had he been thinking about her when he wrote this? The details felt too specific, too personal to be about some hypothetical future love. Someone who laughs at his terrible jokes. Elena had always been the one who found his dry humor funnier than anyone else did, and collecting shells for jars on windowsills. She'd spent every childhood summer doing exactly that, turning her aunt's cottage into a museum of beach treasures. Elena sank into one of the library chairs, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. If Jesse had written this about her, if he'd been thinking about a future with her even back then, why had he never said anything? Why had he let her leave without ever knowing how he felt? She thought about all the times over the years when she'd wondered what would have happened if she'd stayed, if she'd chosen the safety of home over the adventure of the unknown. She'd always assumed Jesse had been relieved when she left, that he'd seen her dreams as a sign they were heading in different directions. But this assignment suggested something else entirely. It suggested that Jesse had loved her and had been too afraid or too selfless to say so. Elena carefully set the paper down and leaned back in her chair, trying to process what she'd discovered. All those careful distances he'd been maintaining, all those moments when he'd seemed about to say something and then pulled back. Maybe it wasn't because he didn't have feelings for her. Maybe it was because he had too many feelings for her and didn't know how to handle them. She picked up the paper again, reading the last line, that this is what home actually means. Sarah had been right. Elena had been so focused on protecting herself from disappointment that she'd completely missed what was right in front of her. Jesse wasn't pulling away because he didn't care. He was pulling away because he cared too much and was terrified of getting his heart broken again. Just like she was. Elena folded the assignment carefully and slipped it into her purse. She needed to think about this, needed to figure out what she was going to do with this new information. But one thing was becoming crystal clear: she couldn't keep pretending this was just a friendly bet between old friends. Whatever was happening between them, it was real. It had been real for a long time. The question was whether she was brave enough to do something about it. Elena looked around the quiet library, filled with stories of love and adventure and people who had taken chances on impossible things. Maybe it was time she started writing her own story. Chapter 13. Elena adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and settled into the beach chair beside Jesse, trying not to think about how cozy this felt. The Palmar Island holiday movie night had taken over the Christmas market space, with a giant screen set up on the side of an old brick building. Only a handful of vendors had stayed open for the evening. The hot chocolate cart was doing steady business. Someone had set up a huge popcorn machine that filled the air with the scent of butter and salt. Families and couples were scattered across the grass with blankets and folding chairs, sheltered from the ocean breeze by the ring of live oak trees that surrounded the market area. Tonight, it was It's a Wonderful Life, which felt both perfect and dangerously appropriate given her current state of mind. "I can't believe they still do this," Elena said, pulling the thick wool blanket higher against the December evening chill. "I remember coming to this with my aunt when I was 12. "Same movie?" Jesse asked, opening a thermos of hot chocolate and offering her the first cup. "I've never been." "Actually, yes," Elena laughed, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "I think they've been showing It's a Wonderful Life every year since the tradition started." "If it's not broken," Jesse said with a shrug, but his smile was warm in the glow from the movie screen. Elena sipped her hot chocolate and tried to focus on the movie, too aware of Jesse beside her. They'd positioned their chairs close together to share the blanket, and every time one of them shifted, their shoulders brushed. After finding his high school assignment yesterday, Elena was seeing everything through a different lens. Every casual touch, every shared glance, every moment of comfortable silence felt charged with possibility, and with the potential for heartbreak. You okay? Jesse asked quietly, leaning closer so he wouldn't disturb the other moviegoers. You seem distracted. Elena looked at him, noting how the light from the screen caught the gold flecks in his gray eyes. He was close enough that she could smell the faint scent of his soap mixed with the crisp night air. Close enough that if she turned her head just slightly, she could— I'm fine, she said quickly, looking back at the screen. Just thinking. Dangerous habit, Jesse said, echoing her words from the boat tour, and Elena felt her heart skip. On screen, George Bailey was discovering what life in Bedford Falls would have been like without him. Elena found herself wondering what her life would have been like if she'd never left Palmar Island, if she'd been brave enough to stay and see what might have developed between her and Jesse. Would they be sitting here now as a real couple instead of as friends playing at dating? Would she have avoided all the heartbreak and disappointment of her years in New York? Or would she have always wondered what else was out there, what adventures she'd missed? Penny for your thoughts, Jesse said during a quiet moment in the movie. Elena glanced around, noting that they were somewhat isolated from the other moviegoers, tucked near the edge of an empty vendor booth where their conversation wouldn't carry. Just wondering about alternate timelines, she said honestly. You know, what if I'd made different choices? Jesse was quiet for a moment, his gaze focused on the screen. Any regrets? Some, Elena admitted. What about you? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd left the island? Pursued that engineering program? Jesse's smile was rueful. Sometimes, but I think we end up where we're supposed to be, even if it takes a while to get there. Something in his tone made Elena look at him more closely. There was a weight to his words that suggested he was talking about more than just career choices. On screen, George Bailey was realizing the impact his life had had on everyone around him. Elena found herself studying Jesse's profile, remembering the boy who'd always been there for her, always steady and reliable and kind. The boy who'd apparently been in love with her and never said a word. Jesse, she started, not sure what she was going to say, but knowing she needed to say something. That's when she noticed it. Someone had hung a sprig of mistletoe from the empty vendor booth's frame above their chairs, probably left over from the weekend market decorations. In the glow from the movie screen, the small green leaves and white berries were clearly visible against the white canvas. Jesse followed her gaze and went very still when he saw it. Well, Elena said softly, her heart racing, that's convenient. Jesse looked back at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Elena. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the want warring with something that looked like fear. This was her chance. This was the moment to be brave, to stop hiding behind the pretense that this was all just a friendly experiment. It's mistletoe, she said quietly, leaning slightly closer. It's practically a holiday requirement. Jesse's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a moment Elena thought he was going to kiss her. The space between them seemed to shrink, and she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin despite the cold night air. But then Jesse pulled back, the spell broken. We should focus on the movie, he said, his voice carefully neutral. This is the good part. Elena felt the rejection like a physical blow, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She pulled the blanket more tightly around herself and fixed her gaze on the screen, linking back the sudden sting of tears. Right, she managed. Of course, for the rest of the movie, Elena made a show of being absorbed in George Bailey's story, occasionally commenting on the plot or laughing at the appropriate moments. But every forced comment felt hollow, and she was acutely aware of Jesse beside her, equally determined to pretend nothing had happened. Maybe Sarah had been wrong. Maybe Jesse really didn't see her as anything more than a friend, and she'd been reading meaning into things that weren't there. Maybe his high school assignment had been about someone else entirely, and she'd just projected her own wishful thinking onto it. When the credits rolled and people began packing up their chairs and blankets, Elena stood quickly, helping Jesse fold everything with mechanical efficiency. They walked to his truck without speaking, the weight of what hadn't happened hanging between them like a thick fog. Jesse opened the passenger door for her, and Elena climbed in without meeting his eyes. The drive to her cottage felt endless, the silence stretching uncomfortably as Jesse navigated the dark island roads. Elena stared out the window, watching the familiar landmarks pass by in a blur of Christmas lights and shadows. Elena, Jesse started as he pulled into her aunt's driveway, his voice careful. About the mistletoe, don't worry about it, Elena interrupted, already reaching for the door handle. I was being silly. Holiday spirit and all that. That's not, Jesse began, but Elena was already climbing out of the truck. Thanks for tonight, she said, her voice bright and false. The movie was great. She closed the truck door before he could respond and hurried up the cottage steps, not trusting herself to look back. Only when she heard his truck pull away did she allow herself to lean against the front door, finally letting the tears fall. Chapter 14. Jesse stared at the half-empty beer bottle in his hands, listening to the familiar sounds of his brother-in-law's garage workshop. Dan was tinkering with his motorcycle's engine, the rhythmic clink of tools providing a soundtrack that usually helped Jesse think. Tonight, though, his thoughts were nothing but noise. "You've been quiet all evening," Dan said without looking up from the bike. "Everything okay?" Jesse took a sip of his beer, buying time. He'd driven over to Dan and Kara's place after dropping Elena off, unable to face the emptiness of his own house. When Dan had suggested they work on the motorcycle, Jesse had jumped at the chance for distraction. But even the familiar ritual of mechanical work wasn't enough to quiet his racing mind. "Just thinking," Jesse said finally. Dan straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. At 45, he was built like the construction foreman he was. Solid, practical, and impossible to fool. He'd been married to Jesse's sister for 8 years, and in that time he'd become something between a brother-in-law and a best friend. "About Elena?" Dan asked, settling onto a nearby stool. Jesse nearly choked on his beer. "How did you—" "Kara mentioned you've been spending time with Meredith's niece," Dan said with a knowing smile. "And you've got that look." "What look?" "The same look I had when I was trying to figure out if your sister was interested in me or just being nice," Dan said. "So what's the story?" Jesse set down his beer and rubbed the back of his neck. "It's complicated." "Most good things are," Dan said. "Talk to me." The whole story came spilling out. The bet about 12 dates, Elena's broken engagement, the way she'd leaned into him on the boat, tonight's disaster with the mistletoe. Jesse found himself confessing things he'd barely admitted to himself, the words tumbling out in the safety of Dan's non-judgmental presence. "She wanted me to kiss her tonight," Jesse said, staring at his hands. "Under the mistletoe. And I pulled back like an idiot." Dan was quiet for a moment, considering. "Why?" "Because I'm terrified," Jesse admitted. "She's been hurt before, Dan. Badly. And she's only here for a couple of weeks while she figures out her life. What if I kiss her and she realizes this was all a mistake? What if she decides she needs to go back to New York, and now I've ruined the friendship too?" "So you'd rather stay friends and watch her leave anyway?" Dan asked gently. Jesse felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "At least then I'd still have something. If I push for more and it doesn't work out, I lose everything." Dan picked up a wrench, turning it over in his hands as he thought. "You know, when I first met Kara, I was convinced she was out of my league. She was this brilliant teacher with her whole life figured out, and I was just a guy who worked with his hands and lived in a trailer." Jesse looked up, surprised. He'd never heard this version of his sister's love story. "I spent months convincing myself we were just friends," Dan continued. "Even after she started giving me all the signals that she wanted more. I was so scared of ruining what we had that I almost let her slip away." "What changed your mind?" Dan smiled, a soft expression that transformed his weathered face. "She called me on it, told me I was being a coward and that she deserved someone brave enough to fight for her. Best lecture I ever got." Jesse felt a familiar ache in his chest. Elena's not the type to call people on things like that. She's too careful, too afraid of getting hurt again. "Maybe," Dan said. "Or maybe she's waiting for you to be brave enough to take the leap." "And if I'm wrong? If she really doesn't feel that way?" Dan set down the wrench and looked at Jesse directly. "Then at least you'll know. And knowing is better than spending the rest of your life wondering what if." Jesse stared at the concrete floor, Dan's words echoing in his mind. "I've been in love with her since we were teenagers," he said quietly. "She left for college, and I never told her how I felt. Then she built this whole life in New York, and I figured I'd missed my chance. Now she's back, but she's fragile, and I don't want to be the one who breaks her." "Jesse," Dan said, his voice gentle but firm, "you can't protect someone from living. And you can't love someone from a distance forever." The truth of it settled over Jesse like a weight. He'd been so focused on proving to Elena that love existed, on showing her through careful gestures and perfect dates that real connection was possible, but he'd been afraid to show her the most important example. His own feelings for her. How could he convince her that love was real and worth fighting for if he wasn't brave enough to fight for it himself? "What if she leaves anyway?" Jesse asked, voicing his deepest fear. "Then at least she'll leave knowing how you feel," Dan said. "And maybe that'll be enough to bring her back." They worked on the motorcycle for another hour, but Jesse's mind was elsewhere. When he finally headed home, Dan's words followed him through the dark island roads. "You can't love someone from a distance forever." Jesse parked in his driveway and sat in the truck for a long moment looking at his empty house. For years, he'd convinced himself that being Elena's friend was enough, that having her in his life in any capacity was better than risking it all for something more. But tonight, watching her face fall when he'd pulled away from the mistletoe, seeing the hurt she'd tried so hard to hide, Jesse realized he'd been lying to himself. His careful distance wasn't protecting either of them. It was just prolonging the inevitable. Elena deserved someone brave enough to fight for her. She deserved someone willing to risk everything for the chance at something real. She deserved better than a man who was too scared to kiss her under the mistletoe. Chapter 15. Jesse adjusted his collar as he walked toward the festival entrance, the sounds of live music and laughter drifting from the town square. The annual Christmas festival was Palmar Island's biggest holiday celebration, with local bands, food vendors, and a fireworks display that drew visitors from the mainland. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight felt like it could be a turning point. After his conversation with Dan 2 nights ago, Jesse had been thinking about everything differently. Dan was right. He couldn't keep loving Elena from a distance, couldn't keep protecting himself from the possibility of heartbreak while missing out on the possibility of real happiness. Tonight, he was going to step up and tell her how he felt. How he'd always felt about her. Elena was waiting by the festival gates, and Jesse's breath caught when he saw her. She'd traded her usual jeans for a deep green dress that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and her hair was swept up in a way that made him want to trace the line of her neck with his fingertips. "You look beautiful," Jesse said, meaning every word. Elena's cheeks flushed pink. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." Jesse had indeed made an effort, trading his usual flannel for a button-down shirt and his work boots for actual dress shoes. The way Elena's eyes lingered on him gave him hope that maybe tonight would be different. "So," Elena said as they walked into the festival, "what's the plan for date number 7? "Dancing," Jesse said, gesturing toward the small stage where a local bluegrass band was playing. "Hot cider, and if we're lucky, the best fireworks display on the coast." "I haven't danced in years," Elena said, but she was smiling. "Good thing I'm a patient teacher," Jesse replied, offering her his arm. They wandered through the festival, sharing a funnel cake and watching the various performances. The atmosphere was magical. Strings of lights crisscrossed overhead, the air smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke, and families and couples swayed together as the music played. When the band started a slow song, Jesse gathered his courage. "Dance with me?" he asked, extending his hand. Elena hesitated for just a moment before placing her hand in his. "I hope you remember what I said about being out of practice." "I'll take my chances," Jesse said, leading her toward the makeshift dance floor. As they moved together, Jesse felt some of the tension that had been building between them start to ease. Elena fit perfectly in his arms, her hand warm in his, her body moving naturally with his to the rhythm of the music. She smelled like pine and winter air from their walk through the festival, something crisp and clean that made him want to bury his face in her hair. "This is nice," Elena said softly, her voice barely audible over the music. "Yeah," Jesse agreed, tightening his hold on her slightly. "It is." They danced through 2 more songs, and with each one, Elena seemed to relax more in his arms. Jesse found himself memorizing everything. The way she laughed when he spun her, the way her eyes lit up when she caught him watching her, the way she didn't pull away when he held her closer than strictly necessary. When the band announced they were taking a break, Jesse reluctantly led Elena off the dance floor. His heart was racing, and he could see something soft and vulnerable in her expression that gave him hope. "Want some cider?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Yes, please," Elena said, and Jesse was pretty sure she was talking about more than just the drink. Jesse made his way to the cider stand, returning with 2 steaming cups. The spiced apple scent mixed with the wood smoke from nearby fire barrels, creating the perfect holiday atmosphere. "It's getting crowded in here," Elena said, accepting her cup gratefully. "Want to find somewhere quieter?" Jesse nodded, following her toward the edge of the festival where a wooden bench sat beneath strands of twinkling lights. The music from the stage was softer here, the crowd thinner, creating an intimate pocket away from the main festivities. They settled on the bench side by side, their shoulders almost touching, steam rising from their cups in the cool night air. Elena took a sip of her cider, and Jesse watched the way the warm lights caught the gold in her eyes. "This is perfect," she said softly, turning to look at him. Jesse set his cup down on the ground beside the bench, then reached over to gently take Elena's cup from her hands, setting it aside as well. When he looked back at her, she was watching him with those brown eyes full of trust and something that might have been longing. The festival lights cast a warm glow over her face, and when she didn't pull away as he shifted closer on the bench, Jesse felt his heart pound against his ribs. He cupped her face gently with one hand, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "Elena," he said softly, her name a question and a prayer all at once. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as he leaned toward her. When their lips met, it was everything Jesse had imagined and more. Soft and sweet and perfect, tasting like cinnamon and possibility and home. Elena's hand fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Jesse felt his heart soar. This was what he'd been waiting for his entire life. But the moment was shattered by the sharp ring of Elena's phone from her purse. She jerked away from him, her eyes wide and startled, her hand flying to her lips. "I'm sorry," she whispered, fumbling for her phone. "I should have turned it off," but she glanced at the screen and went pale. "I have to take this." Jesse watched as Elena stood and walked several steps away, accepting the call with a shaking hand. "John, I told you not to call me," Elena was saying, her voice strained but quiet enough that Jesse had to strain to hear. "I don't want to talk about this." Jesse felt his stomach drop. John Huggs, Jahak, her ex-fiancé, the man who'd cheated on her, who'd broken her heart so badly she'd sworn off love entirely. Elena turned her back to him, walking even further away, but Jesse could still see the tension in her shoulders, the way she pressed her free hand to her forehead. The conversation continued for several minutes, Elena's voice rising and falling with obvious emotion. Jesse couldn't make out the words, but he could see how upset she was becoming. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elena ended the call and walked slowly back to the bench. Her face was pale, her hand still shaking slightly as she slipped her phone back into her purse. "Sorry about that," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I should have turned my phone off." Jesse studied her face, noting the way she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Elena said quickly, sitting back down on the bench but maintaining careful distance between them. "Just old business." The magic of their kiss felt like a distant memory. Elena was here physically, but Jesse could see that her mind was still caught up in whatever John had said to her. The way she'd gone pale at his name, the length of their conversation, the fact that she was still clearly affected by it. It all painted a picture Jesse didn't want to see. She was still in love with her ex. Maybe she always would be. And Jesse was just the safe choice, the hometown friend who was convenient and comfortable but not worth fighting for when the real thing came calling. "The fireworks should start soon," Elena said, clearly trying to salvage the evening. "Yeah," Jesse agreed, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. They found a spot in the center of town with the other festival goers, standing side by side, but no longer touching. When the first firework exploded overhead in a shower of gold and red, Jesse should have been watching Elena's face light up with wonder. Instead, he was staring at the ground, wondering how he'd been stupid enough to think this could work. The fireworks continued to bloom overhead, but Jesse barely saw them. All he could think about was Elena's conversation with John, the way she'd looked so shaken afterward. Whatever they'd talked about, it had clearly affected her deeply. When the grand finale lit up the sky, Jesse applauded politely and Elena turned to ask where he was parked. They walked to his truck in relative silence, the memory of their kiss now overshadowed by everything that had come after. The drive to Elena's place was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When Jesse pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine and got out, walking around to open her door. Old habits. "Thank you for tonight," Elena said as they walked up the cottage steps together. The dancing was really nice. The dancing, not the kiss. Not the moment they'd shared before her phone rang and pulled her back to her past. They stopped at her front door, and Jesse found himself stepping closer, drawn by the memory of their kiss despite everything that had happened since. The porch light cast a warm glow over Elena's face, and for a moment he considered leaning in again, trying to recapture what they'd lost. But Elena spoke first, her voice small and uncertain. "Jesse, about the phone call. Elena, you don't have to explain anything to me," Jesse said, the words coming out more sharply than he'd intended. "We're friends. That's all this is." The words were meant to protect them both, but Jesse saw the way they hit Elena like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and she fumbled in her purse for her keys. "Right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Friends. Good night, Jesse." She unlocked the door quickly and stepped inside, closing it softly behind her before Jesse could respond. He stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the closed door and wondering how he'd managed to ruin everything again. 7 dates down, 5 to go. If they'd make it that far. Chapter 16. Elena sat at her kitchen table the next morning, staring at her phone and replaying Jesse's words from the night before. "We're friends. That's all this is." The coldness in his voice when he'd said it made her chest ache all over again. She'd barely slept, her mind spinning between the memory of their perfect kiss and the way everything had fallen apart afterward. John's phone call had shattered the moment, but not in the way Jesse thought. Elena picked up her phone and scrolled to John's contact, her finger hovering over the delete button. She should have done this months ago, should have cut all ties the moment she'd caught him with his coworker. But some part of her had held on to the familiar, even when the familiar was toxic. Last night had been the final straw. "I know you're in South Carolina," John had said when she'd answered, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Sarah told me. This is ridiculous, Elena. You're hiding on some island pretending to be someone you're not." "I'm not hiding," Elena had replied, walking away from Jesse so he wouldn't have to hear this. "I'm moving on." "With some small-town nobody?" John had laughed bitterly. "Come on, Elena, you're better than that. We're better than that. I made a mistake, but we can fix this." "No, we can't," Elena had said firmly, her voice stronger than she'd felt in months. "I don't love you anymore, John. I don't even like you. Stop calling me. Don't contact me again." She'd hung up and blocked his number immediately, but the damage was already done. When she'd returned to the bench, Jesse had pulled away from her emotionally, his walls firmly back in place. He'd spent the rest of the evening being polite but distant, and his parting words had made it clear that he thought she was still hung up on her ex. Elena deleted John's contact and tossed her phone aside with more force than necessary. She'd finally found the courage to cut ties with her past, but Jesse didn't know that. To him, she probably looked like a woman who couldn't let go, who was still answering her ex's calls and getting upset about old business. The irony was devastating. A soft knock at the cottage door interrupted her brooding. Elena opened it to find Jesse standing on her porch, looking uncomfortable and holding a toolbox. "Morning," he said, his tone carefully polite. "You mentioned the other day that you'd been cold at night. Thought I'd check the heating vents, make sure they're not blocked." Elena had mentioned it in passing during one of their earlier conversations, back when things had been easy between them. The fact that he'd remembered made her chest tighten. "That's thoughtful of you," she said, stepping aside to let him in. She noted the way he avoided meeting her eyes. "I think it might just be the bedroom." "I'll take a look," Jesse said, his voice neutral. "Won't take long." The formality between them felt like a physical barrier. Gone was the easy warmth they'd shared for weeks, replaced by the kind of politeness reserved for strangers. Elena watched Jesse head toward the bedroom, his shoulders rigid with tension. She tried to focus on other things while he worked, making tea, organizing her aunt's books, anything to keep her hands busy. But the sound of him moving furniture and checking vents was a constant reminder of how everything had changed. When Jesse emerged 30 minutes later, Elena was curled up on the couch with a cup of tea and one of her aunt's romance novels, though she hadn't read a single word. "Found the problem," Jesse said, wiping his hands on a rag. "The vent in your bedroom was almost completely blocked by dust. Should be much warmer tonight." "Thank you," Elena said, setting down her book. "How much do I owe you?" Jesse's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nothing. Just being neighborly." Elena nodded, unsure what else to say. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they weren't discussing. "Jesse," she started, then stopped. What could she say? That she'd told John she didn't love him? That she'd blocked his number? Jesse had made it clear last night that they were just friends, nothing more. Explaining about John would only make things more awkward. "I should get going," Jesse said, gathering his tools. "Have a good day, Elena." "You too," she managed, watching him leave without looking back. After the door closed, Elena sank deeper into the couch cushions and pulled her aunt's throw blanket around her shoulders. The cottage felt emptier somehow, as if Jesse had taken some of its warmth with him when he left. She picked up her phone and called Sarah, needing to hear a friendly voice. "How did it go with the mysterious island man?" Sarah asked immediately. "Did you figure out if he likes you?" Elena let out a bitter laugh. "We kissed. And then everything fell apart." "Wait, what?" "Start from the beginning." Elena found herself telling Sarah about the festival, the dancing, the perfect kiss under the twinkling lights. But when she got to John's phone call and Jesse's reaction, her voice started to shake. "So he thinks you're still hung up on John?" Sarah asked when Elena finished. "Apparently," Elena said, pulling the blanket tighter. "And I can't exactly chase after him and explain that I told John to leave me alone because that would make me look desperate. Besides, Jesse made it pretty clear that we're just friends. Elena, Sarah said gently, maybe he said that because he thought you were still in love with your ex. Maybe he was protecting himself. Or maybe he realized that kissing me was a mistake and he's using John as an excuse to back away, Elena countered. I can't keep doing this, Sarah. I can't keep hoping for things that aren't going to happen. Sarah was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Elena looked around the cottage, taking in the cozy warmth of her aunt's decorations, the view of the harbor through the kitchen window, the stack of books she'd been meaning to read. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe it's time to seriously consider moving back to the city. Don't make any big decisions while you're upset, Sarah advised. Give it a few days, see what happens. But as Elena hung up and sat alone in the quiet cottage, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been fooling herself about Palmar Island, about starting over, about Jesse. Maybe she was meant to be alone. Maybe some people just weren't meant for happy endings. Outside, gray clouds gathered over the harbor, making the December afternoon feel as cold and empty as Elena felt inside. 7 dates down, 5 to go. But Elena was starting to wonder if they'd ever make it to 12. And more importantly, she was starting to wonder if it even mattered anymore. Chapter 17. Jesse stood outside Elena's place, questioning his decision to keep their arrangement going. After everything that had happened at the festival, after watching her take that phone call from her ex and seeing how shaken she'd been, the smart thing would be to call off the remaining dates. But something stubborn in him refused to give up, even if it was just pride at this point. He'd promised her 12 dates to prove love existed. Backing out now would feel like admitting defeat, and despite everything, he wasn't ready to let go of the small hope that things could still change between them. When Elena opened the door, she looked surprised to see him. Jesse, I wasn't sure you'd still want to do this. A deal's a deal, Jesse said, keeping his voice neutral. Ready for some caroling? Elena hesitated, then grabbed her coat. Sure, why not? The walk to the town square was awkward, filled with polite small talk that felt nothing like the easy conversations they'd shared just days before. Jesse found himself missing the comfortable silences, the way Elena used to laugh at his dry observations about island life. The caroling group was already assembled when they arrived. About 15 locals of various ages stood together, all bundled up against the December evening and clutching songbooks. Miss Doris was there, of course, directing everyone with the efficiency of a symphony conductor. Jesse, Helena, Miss Doris called out, waving them over. Perfect timing. We're just about to start our route. Jesse noticed the way the older woman's eyes darted between him and Elena, clearly sensing the tension but wisely not commenting. Instead, she handed them each a songbook and launched into her annual speech about spreading holiday cheer throughout the community. The first few houses went smoothly enough. Jesse and Elena stood side by side in the group, their voices blending with the others as they sang familiar carols. But Jesse noticed the careful distance Elena maintained, the way she seemed to be trying not to accidentally brush against him. It was at the 4th house that everything went sideways. The elderly couple who answered the door looked delighted to see the carolers. George and Martha Henley had lived on Palmar Island for 60 years, and their faces lit up as the group launched into silent night. They stood close together on their porch, Martha's hand tucked into the crook of George's arm, both of them swaying gently to the music. After the song ended, Martha clapped her hands together with obvious joy. "Oh, that was beautiful. Thank you all so much." George smiled warmly at the group, but his gaze settled on Jesse and Elena standing next to each other. "You know, Martha, they remind me of us when we were their age, that same sweet energy between them." "Oh yes," Martha agreed, her eyes twinkling as she looked between Jesse and Elena. "Young love during the holidays is such a blessing. You can just see it in the way you look at each other." Jesse felt his cheeks burn as several members of the caroling group turned to look at him and Elena with amused expressions. Elena went rigid beside him, her face carefully blank. "We're just friends," Jesse said quickly, the words coming out more sharply than he'd intended. "Miss Elena and I are just friends." The sweet expressions on the elderly couple's faces faltered slightly, and Jesse immediately felt like he'd kicked a puppy. Martha's smile became a bit forced as she nodded politely. "Of course, dear," she said gently. "Well, friendship is wonderful too." George cleared his throat awkwardly. "Thank you again for the lovely music. Merry Christmas." They finished the rest of their caroling route in strained silence. Elena sang along with the group, smiled politely at the families who came to their doors, and thanked Miss Doris when the evening ended, but Jesse could feel the tension radiating from her. When the group began to disperse, Elena started walking quickly toward the parking area without waiting for him. "Elena, wait," Jesse called, jogging to catch up with her. She turned to face him, and Jesse was startled to see hurt in her eyes rather than anger. "Is that really all we are to you?" she asked, her voice quiet but strained. "After everything we've shared, we're still just friends?" Jesse felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "Elena, I didn't mean—" "You said it so quickly," Elena said, wrapping her arms around herself. "So definitively. Like you wanted to make absolutely sure no one got the wrong idea about us." "That's not what I meant," Jesse said, stepping closer. Elena shook her head, tears threatening. "I'm probably being ridiculous. I know I don't have any right to expect anything more. But when you dismiss us like that, in front of everyone—" She trailed off, looking away. "Elena," Jesse said gently. "I'm scared, Jesse," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of wanting something you clearly don't want. And I'm scared that by wanting it, I'm going to ruin the friendship we do have." Jesse stared at her, seeing how vulnerable she was trying to be, how much courage it was taking for her to say this. "I should go," Elena said, taking a step back. "I need some space to think." She turned and walked away, leaving Jesse standing alone on the sidewalk. He watched her disappear into the shadows. Chapter 18. Elena sat at Miss Doris's kitchen table, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug of chamomile tea and trying to pretend she wasn't falling apart. She'd called Miss Doris that morning in a moment of desperation, needing to talk to someone who wasn't 3,000 miles away and invested in her moving back to New York. "Thank you for letting me come over," Elena said, staring into her tea. "I know it's short notice." "Nonsense, dear," Miss Doris said, settling into the chair across from her with her own mug. "You sounded like you needed a friend, and I always have time for tea and conversation." Elena took a sip of the perfectly brewed tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. Miss Doris's kitchen was exactly what a grandmother's kitchen should be, with its warm yellow walls, vintage teacups, and the lingering scent of fresh-baked cookies. It was the kind of place that made you want to spill your secrets. "How are things going with your 12 dates?" Miss Doris asked gently. "I heard you and Jesse went caroling last night." Elena let out a bitter laugh. "It was a disaster. Everything's a disaster, actually." Miss Doris waited patiently, her kind eyes encouraging Elena to continue. "I don't know what I'm doing," Elena admitted, the words tumbling out. "Jesse kissed me at the festival and it was perfect. But then my ex called and everything went wrong. Now Jesse thinks I'm still hung up on John and he keeps telling people we're just friends. But I'm not hung up on John. I told him to leave me alone and blocked his number." Miss Doris was quiet for a moment, studying Elena's face with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see everything. Finally, she set down her teacup with a gentle clink. "Elena, dear, let me ask you something. Why haven't you told Jesse what you said to your ex?" Elena shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Because it would look like I'm trying too hard, like I'm making excuses." "Or," Miss Doris said, her tone gentle but firm, "because you're scared. You're using Jesse's assumptions as a convenient wall to hide behind." Elena opened her mouth to protest, but Miss Doris held up a hand. "Think about it, sweetheart. Jesse believes you're still in love with your ex because you've given him every reason to think so. You took the call, you were visibly upset, and then you refused to explain what happened. What's he supposed to think?" Elena felt her cheeks burn with shame. "I thought I was protecting myself." "You were," Miss Doris agreed, "but you were also being unfair to Jesse. He can't read your mind, Elena. If you want him to know you're done with your past, you have to tell him." The truth of it hit Elena like a slap. She'd been so focused on protecting herself that she'd essentially lied by omission, letting Jesse believe something that wasn't true. "I've made a mess of everything, haven't I?" Elena said quietly. Miss Doris reached across the table and patted Elena's hand. "Nothing that can't be fixed with a little honesty. But Elena, dear, what are you really afraid of?" Elena stared into her tea, Miss Doris's question echoing in her mind. "Getting hurt again," she admitted finally. "Of course you are," Miss Doris said. "Love is terrifying. But you know what's scarier? Spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been because you were too afraid to be honest." Miss Doris leaned back in her chair, studying Elena with those knowing eyes. "Can I tell you something about Jesse?" Elena nodded. "That young man has been carrying a torch for you since you were teenagers. I've watched him for years, turning down perfectly nice women because none of them were you. When you left for college, he was heartbroken but too proud to say anything. When you built a life in New York, he convinced himself he'd missed his chance. And now that you're back, he's terrified of ruining his second opportunity by pushing too hard." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. But he keeps saying we're friends because he thinks you're still in love with your ex, Miss Doris interrupted. You've been so busy protecting yourself that you've missed what's right in front of you. The real thing isn't always fireworks and grand gestures, Elena. Sometimes it's the man who shows up on your doorstep, who remembers how you like your coffee, who's been quietly loving you for 15 years. If you keep waiting for fireworks, you'll miss the man who's been carrying the sparkler all along. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear she'd been carrying. I need to tell him the truth about John. Yes, you do, Miss Doris said firmly. And you need to tell him how you feel. Jesse isn't your ex, Elena. He's not going to cheat on you or make you feel small. He's the kind of man who shows love through actions, not words. He's been showing you how he feels this whole time. You just haven't been ready to see it. Elena thought about the way Jesse had taken her out on his boat, showing her the stars reflected in the calm water, the patient way he'd worked beside her making snow globes at the Christmas market, how he'd fixed her heating vents without being asked, the way he'd looked at her when he'd brushed flour from her cheek during their baking disaster, the reverence in his touch when he'd kissed her. What am I so afraid of? Elena asked, more to herself than to Miss Doris. Being vulnerable, Miss Doris said simply. But Elena, dear, vulnerability is the price of admission for real love. You can't have one without the other. I need to tell him the truth about John, Elena said. Yes, you do, Miss Doris said firmly. And you need to tell him how you feel. Elena nodded, feeling more determined. He texted me this morning suggesting we go hiking on the nature trail tomorrow for our next date. I was dreading it because things have been so awkward between us, but now, maybe it's an opportunity to finally be honest with him. A walk through the woods does sound like the perfect place for a heart-to-heart conversation, Miss Doris agreed with a knowing smile. Just the two of you, no distractions, plenty of time to talk. Elena stood, then impulsively leaned down to hug the older woman. Thank you. For the tea, for the advice, for calling me out when I needed it. Anytime, Miss Doris said, her eyes twinkling. Now go get your man before he convinces himself you're better off without him. Chapter 19. Elena stood at her kitchen window, watching the gray clouds drift across the sky. The weather looked unsettled, but not terrible, overcast with a light breeze that made the trees sway gently. She and Jesse had planned to meet at the nature trail at 2 o'clock, and Elena was determined to go through with it. Today was the day she was finally going to tell him everything. She'd spent the morning rehearsing what she wanted to say, pacing around until she'd practically worn a path in Aunt Meredith's hardwood floors. She would tell Jesse about John, how she'd ended things completely, how she'd blocked his number. Most importantly, she would tell Jesse how she felt about him. The thought made her stomach flutter with nerves, but Miss Doris had been right. She couldn't keep hiding behind walls, waiting for Jesse to read her mind. Elena pulled on her hiking boots and grabbed her light rain jacket, checking her phone one more time. Jesse had texted 30 minutes ago, weather's looking a little iffy. Want to grab coffee instead? She'd stared at the message, knowing he was probably being sensible. But the thought of sitting across from him in the roasted bean, trying to have this conversation while other people chatted around them, made her anxiety spike even higher. She texted back, I need to walk. The trail should be fine. It doesn't look that bad out there. His reply came quickly, see you at 2. By the time Elena reached the nature trail parking area, Jesse's truck was already there. He got out as she parked, wearing his usual flannel shirt and a light jacket. The wind had picked up a bit, rustling through the trees, but it still didn't seem threatening. You sure about this? Jesse asked, glancing up at the sky. Those clouds look pretty heavy. It's fine, Elena said, though she could feel her nerves jangling like live wires. I just need to move, you know? I've been cooped up in the house all morning. Jesse studied her face for a moment, then nodded. Okay, but if it starts to rain, we're turning back. Deal, Elena agreed, grateful that he wasn't pushing harder. They started down the trail together, and Elena immediately felt some of her tension ease. This was good. The steady rhythm of walking, the quiet rustle of leaves overhead, the familiar presence of Jesse beside her was calming. She could do this. She could finally tell him everything. You seem wound up, Jesse observed after they'd been walking for about 10 minutes. Everything okay? Elena took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. I need to tell you some things, she said. About John, about us. Jesse glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. What about John? That night at the festival, when he called, Elena said, her heart rate picking up again. I told him I don't love him anymore. I hung up on him and blocked his number. I'm done with him, Jesse. I have been for months. Jesse stopped walking. Elena, I know you think I'm still hung up on him, Elena continued, the words tumbling out faster now. But I'm not. I haven't been for a long time. I was scared to tell you because I thought it would sound like I was making excuses or trying too hard. A rumble of thunder in the distance made them both look up. The clouds had gotten noticeably darker while they'd been talking, and the wind was starting to gust more strongly through the trees. We should head back, Jesse said, but Elena was already moving forward on the trail. It's just a little thunder, she said, her nervous energy making it impossible to stand still. We're fine under the tree cover. Jesse caught up with her, his expression concerned. Elena, storms move in fast here. You forget how close we are to the ocean. The wind was picking up rapidly now, sending leaves swirling around them, and the first fat raindrops were starting to fall. There's more I need to tell you, Elena said, almost shouting to be heard over the increasing wind. About New York, about how I feel about. A sharp crack overhead cut her off. A branch, suddenly heavy with rain and buffeted by wind, snapped and crashed to the trail just feet in front of them. Jesse grabbed her arm, pulling her back. That's it, he said firmly. We're getting out of here. Now. Elena looked ahead on the trail, then back the way they'd come. We're almost halfway through. Let's keep going. Elena, this is getting dangerous, Jesse said, rain starting to stream down his face. That's when the storm hit in earnest. What had been scattered raindrops became a deluge driven by winds that sent the trees swaying and creaking ominously overhead. The trail, which had been dry and pleasant 20 minutes before, turned into a muddy stream as water began rushing down the path. Elena tried to keep moving forward, but her feet slipped out from under her on the slick earth. She went down hard, landing on her hands and knees in the cold mud, her light jacket instantly soaked through. Elena. Jesse was beside her in seconds, helping her to her feet. His hands were steady and warm, even as rain poured off the brim of his cap. Are you hurt? When Elena tried to put weight on her left ankle, she winced. Pain shot up her leg. I think I twisted something. Jesse's face went pale. Can you walk? Elena took a tentative step and nodded, though her ankle throbbed. I'm okay. Jesse, you were right. I didn't realize how fast the weather could change. The ocean, Jesse said grimly, keeping one arm around her waist to steady her. Storms come in quick and hard. We need to get back to the cars. The walk back felt endless. Elena's ankle made every step painful, and the rain soaked through her inadequate jacket until she was shivering uncontrollably. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, making her teeth chatter. Jesse stayed close beside her, guiding her around fallen branches and helping her over the slippery spots, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. When they finally reached the parking lot, Elena was shaking so hard she could barely walk steadily. Jesse guided her to his truck, helping her into the passenger seat. I'm driving you home, Jesse said, starting the truck and cranking the heat up as high as it would go. You're hypothermic. I'm fine, Elena protested weakly, but her whole body was shaking and she couldn't seem to stop. Jesse turned to look at her, and Elena was struck by the intensity in his gray eyes. You are not fine, he said, his voice tight with controlled worry. You're soaked and shivering and you're hurt. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. I'm sorry. I should have listened to you about the weather. Hey, Jesse said, his voice gentler now as he reached over to brush a wet strand of hair from her face. You forgot how fast these coastal storms move in. That's all. Elena leaned into his touch, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. I ruined everything. I had this whole speech planned, and now nothing, Jesse interrupted softly. Let's get you home and warm. We can talk about everything else once you're not turning blue. Chapter 20. Jesse kept one eye on the road and one on Elena as he drove through the worsening storm. She was still shivering despite the truck's heater running at full blast, and he could see pain flickering across her face every time he hit a bump or pothole. They were halfway to her aunt's cottage when the streetlights suddenly flickered and went out. One by one, the houses they passed went dark, their warm porch lights and window glows disappearing into the stormy night. Power's out, Jesse said, slowing the truck as he navigated the now pitch-black streets. He glanced at Elena, noting how small she looked hunched in the passenger seat. Your aunt's place is going to be freezing without heat. My house has lanterns and camping gear, plus I've got a gas stove that'll still work. You shouldn't be alone in a cold, dark cottage right now. Elena looked out at the dark neighborhood, then back at Jesse. Her teeth were still chattering slightly. Okay, she said quietly. Thank you. When they pulled into his driveway, Jesse helped her out of the truck, noting how she leaned heavily on him as they made their way to his front door. The wind was still howling, sending rain sideways across the porch. Inside, Jesse's house was pitch black but warm. He felt his way to the kitchen counter where he kept an emergency flashlight, then quickly gathered battery-powered lanterns from his emergency kit. The soft, warm glow immediately made the space feel welcoming. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Jesse said, noting how Elena's lips had a slight blue tinge. "You're hypothermic." He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with flannel pajama pants, wool socks, and a soft sweatshirt. "These will be too big, but they're warm and dry." Jesse helped Elena to the bathroom, setting a lantern inside for light. "Take your time," he said gently. "I'll be right outside if you need help." While Elena changed, Jesse pulled on a dry shirt and pants himself. He started water heating on his gas stove, found towels for her wet hair, and prepared an ice pack wrapped in a soft kitchen towel. When he heard her call softly that she was done, he knocked gently. "Can I come in? I brought a towel for your hair." Elena opened the door, and Jesse's heart clenched at how fragile she looked. His oversized clothes hung loose on her smaller frame, the flannel pajama pants rolled up at the cuffs, the wool socks making her look younger, more vulnerable. "Here," Jesse said, stepping behind her. "Let me help." He gently towel-dried her hair, his movements careful and tender. Elena leaned back slightly into his touch, and Jesse felt something shift between them. This wasn't about attraction or romance, it was about care, about one person taking care of another who needed it. "Better?" he asked softly. Elena nodded, her eyes meeting his in the bathroom mirror. "Thank you." Jesse helped her back to the living room, supporting her weight as she limped on her injured ankle. He settled her on the couch with pillows propped behind her back and carefully placed the ice pack against her swollen ankle. "How's that?" he asked, adjusting the towel around the ice pack. "Good," Elena said, wincing slightly at the cold but not pulling away. Jesse disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. The rich scent filled the air, mixing with the faint smell of wood smoke from outside and the clean scent of rain. "This is perfect," Elena said, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. She took a sip and sighed contentedly. "I feel human again." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the storm rage outside. The lantern light created an intimate cocoon around them, and Jesse found himself studying Elena's face in the warm glow. She looked peaceful for the first time since he'd picked her up for their hike. "Jesse," Elena said finally, setting down her mug. "Earlier, on the trail, I was trying to tell you something important." Jesse's pulse quickened, but before Elena could continue, a violent shiver ran through her body. The hypothermia was clearly still affecting her, despite the warm clothes and hot drink. "You're still cold," Jesse said, immediately standing. "Here." He grabbed a thick throw blanket from the back of his chair and settled back onto the couch beside Elena, wrapping the blanket around both of them. She instinctively leaned into his warmth, and Jesse felt his breath catch at the simple trust in the gesture. "Better?" he asked, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "Much," Elena murmured, her head finding its way to his shoulder. "You always take such good care of people." Jesse felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "Just you," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Elena looked up at him, something soft and wondering in her brown eyes. "Jesse." Another violent gust of wind rattled the windows, making them both glance toward the storm outside. The moment broke, but the awareness remained, humming between them like electricity. "What were you trying to tell me?" Jesse asked gently. "On the trail?" Elena settled back against his shoulder, her voice quiet but steady. "About John. About that phone call at the festival." Jesse went still, waiting. "I need you to know that I told him I don't love him anymore," Elena said. "I hung up on him and blocked his number. I'm done with him, Jesse. I have been for months." Jesse felt something tight in his chest start to loosen. "Why didn't you tell me that night?" "Because I was scared," Elena admitted. "Scared of looking desperate, scared of pushing too hard, but mostly scared of being vulnerable again." Jesse's arm tightened around her slightly. "You don't have to be scared with me, Ellie." The childhood nickname slipped out naturally, and Elena's breath hitched slightly at the sound of it. "I know," she said softly. "I'm starting to understand that." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Jesse's living room, wrapped in blankets and lantern light, something had shifted between them. Jesse felt it in the way Elena had relaxed against him, in the trust implicit in her confession about John. For now it was enough. Elena was warm and safe in his arms, and Jesse felt a quiet contentment settle over him. Chapter 21. The storm outside had quieted to a gentle patter of rain against the windows, and Elena could feel some of the tension leaving her body as she sat curled against Jesse's side. "How's the ankle?" Jesse asked softly. Elena carefully flexed her foot, testing the swelling. Better, I think. Still sore, but better. Good, Jesse said, but he made no move to untangle himself from their position on the couch. Are you hungry? I should probably get some food in you. Elena realized she was starving. She'd been too nervous for lunch before their disastrous hike, and it had to be close to dinner time now. Actually, yes, very. Jesse carefully shifted out from under her, making sure she was comfortable before standing. Let me see what I can put together. Don't move that ankle. Elena watched him disappear into the kitchen, listening to the sounds of him moving around, opening cabinets and the refrigerator. The domestic simplicity of it made her chest warm in a way that had nothing to do with the hot chocolate. When Jesse returned, he was carrying a tray with an odd assortment of items. Elena blinked in surprise as he set it down on the coffee table. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? She asked, noting the carefully cut triangles arranged on a plate alongside a thermos and 2 mugs. Jesse's cheeks flushed slightly as he settled back onto the couch beside her. They were always your favorite. When we were kids, you'd bring them on every beach trip. Elena's heart did something complicated in her chest. You remember that? I remember everything about those summers, Jesse said quietly, pouring steaming cocoa from the thermos into the mugs. The way you'd eat the crusts first, then the middle. How you always insisted grape jelly was better than strawberry. The way you'd save half your sandwich to feed the seagulls, even though Miss Doris told us not to. Elena stared at him, overwhelmed by the specificity of his memories. Jesse. I thought maybe. Jesse gestured toward the makeshift meal, suddenly looking uncertain. I don't know. I wanted to do something that would make you feel better. Something that reminded you of when things were simple. Elena picked up one of the sandwich triangles, noting that he'd cut them exactly the way she used to prefer them. The peanut butter was the good kind, creamy and slightly sweet, and the jelly was indeed grape. Even the bread was soft white bread, the kind her mother had always bought for summer lunches. This is perfect, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. They ate in comfortable silence, the simple food tasting better than any fancy meal. Outside, the rain continued its gentle rhythm, but inside Jesse's living room, Elena felt like she was 15 again, sitting on beach blankets with salt-sticky hair and sand between her toes. Do you remember, Elena said, taking a sip of cocoa, that summer when we tried to build the world's largest sandcastle? Jesse's eyes lit up with the memory. You insisted we needed architectural plans. You spent half an hour drawing blueprints in the sand before we even started building. It was going to be magnificent, Elena said, laughing. Turrets and a moat and everything. And then the tide came in, Jesse said, grinning. 3 hours of work, gone in 10 minutes, Elena said, but she was smiling at the memory. I cried. You did, Jesse said softly. And I promised we'd build an even better one the next day. But we never did, Elena said. I got distracted by something else, some book I wanted to read, or... She trailed off, realizing what she was saying. Even then, she'd been the one who moved on, who looked ahead to the next thing instead of appreciating what was right in front of her. You were always looking toward the horizon, Jesse said gently, as if reading her thoughts. Even as a kid, I used to watch you stare out at the water like you could see all the places you wanted to go. Elena set down her mug, studying Jesse's face in the lantern light. What about you? What did you used to think about when you looked at the water? Jesse was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes holding hers. I used to think about how I could make you want to stay. The simple honesty of it took Elena's breath away. Jesse. I know you had dreams, Jesse continued, his voice steady but soft. Big dreams about seeing the world, writing about amazing places. I never wanted to be the thing that held you back from those dreams, but I always hoped that maybe someday you'd realize that home could be an adventure too. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. I think I'm finally starting to understand that. Jesse reached over and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Better late than never. The touch was so tender, so full of quiet understanding that Elena felt something shift deep in her chest. This wasn't just attraction or friendship anymore. This was recognition. Jesse wasn't just offering her comfort, he was offering her a home. A place where she was known completely, where her quirks were remembered and cherished, where she could be exactly who she was without pretense or performance. You know me, Elena said softly, the words slipping out like a breath, better than anyone ever has. You've always known me. Jesse's hand was still cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her skin. Elena. I care about you so much, Elena continued, her heart pounding. More than I thought I could care about anyone again. You make me feel like I'm home. Jesse's smile was soft and wondering. You are home, he said simply. You always have been, even when you were 3,000 miles away. When he leaned in to kiss her, Elena met him halfway. This kiss was different from their first at the festival, more meaningful and full of promise. It tasted like peanut butter and cocoa in coming home. It felt like the end of a very long journey and the beginning of something wonderful. When they finally broke apart, Elena rested her forehead against Jesse's, both of them breathing slightly unsteadily. So, Elena said, her voice soft and teasing, "How many dates is that? 11? Jesse chuckled, his arms tightening around her. 11? One more to go. Any ideas for number 12? Elena asked. Jesse's smile was mysterious and full of promise. I might have something in mind. Chapter 22. Jesse woke to the sound of the refrigerator humming back to life. He blinked in the early morning light streaming through his living room windows, momentarily disoriented. Elena was still curled against his side on the couch, her head on his shoulder, both of them having fallen asleep sometime after their second round of peanut butter sandwiches and quiet conversation that had stretched late into the night. The power was back on. Jesse carefully extracted his arm from beneath Elena, trying not to wake her as he stood and stretched the kinks out of his back. Sleeping on the couch hadn't been the most comfortable, but he wouldn't trade the night for anything. He glanced down at Elena, still peaceful in sleep. Her dark hair tumbled across the throw pillow, and felt his chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to complete happiness. The spell was broken by the sharp buzz of Elena's phone from across the room. Jesse glanced at her, but she was still sleeping soundly, exhausted from yesterday's ordeal. The phone buzzed again, insistent. "Elena," Jesse said softly, gently shaking her shoulder. "Your phone." Elena stirred, blinking slowly as she oriented herself. "Oh, right." She sat up carefully, testing her ankle before standing. "What time is it?" "Almost 8, Jesse said, retrieving her purse and handing it to her. "Power's back on." Elena pulled out her phone, frowning at the screen. "I have 5 missed calls from my old editor in New York." She looked up at Jesse, confusion clear in her expression. "That's weird. Michael never calls unless..." The phone rang again, Michael's name flashing on the screen. "I should take this," Elena said, already swiping to answer. "Michael? Is everything okay?" Jesse moved toward the kitchen to give her privacy, but Elena's voice carried across the open space as the conversation progressed. "What? Are you serious?" Elena's voice pitched higher with surprise. "But I thought the magazine was downsizing after the merger." Jesse found himself slowing his movements, unable to help listening as he started a pot of coffee. That's a lot more than I was making before," Elena said, and Jesse felt his stomach drop. There was a long pause, then Elena laughed, but it sounded strained. "Michael, I'm in South Carolina. I can't just hop on a plane this afternoon." Another pause. Jesse gripped the coffee mug tighter. "Can I think about it? I know it's short notice, but this is a big decision." Elena's voice had gone quiet, almost uncertain. "Okay, yes. I'll call you back by tonight." Jesse heard her hang up and turned to find her standing in his living room, phone still clutched in her hand, looking stunned. "Everything okay?" Jesse asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Elena sank back onto the couch, staring at her phone. "That was my old editor at Metropolitan Travel. The magazine got bought out by a bigger company and they want to expand their digital presence. They're offering me a senior editor position, basically my old job, but with a promotion and a 30% salary increase." Jesse set down his coffee mug, not trusting his hands to stay steady. "That's great news." "They want me to start Monday," Elena continued, her voice distant. "He needs someone who knows the publication, who can hit the ground running. And Jesse, the money." She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide. "It's more than I ever thought I'd make. It would solve all my financial problems, give me the security I've been looking for." "When do you have to decide?" Jesse asked, proud of how calm his voice sounded. "Tonight," Elena said. "Tomorrow morning at the latest." Jesse nodded, his mind racing. This was exactly what Elena had been looking for when she'd come back to Palmar Island, a chance to rebuild her career, to reclaim the life that had been derailed by her broken engagement. It was everything she'd said she wanted. The words "don't go" were on the tip of his tongue, but he forced them back. Elena deserved better than a man who would ask her to give up her dreams. "I need to go get my car," Elena said suddenly, standing and looking around for her wet clothes from the night before. "I need to think, and I can't do that here." "I'll drive you," Jesse said automatically. "You don't have to, Elena," Jesse interrupted gently. "I'm driving you." The ride to the nature trail parking lot was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Elena's car sat where they'd left it the day before, looking somehow forlorn in the aftermath of the storm. Branches and debris littered the parking area, evidence of the weather they'd escaped. Jesse pulled up beside Elena's car and put his truck in park, but neither of them moved to get out. "Jesse," Elena said finally, her voice small, "what should I do?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Jesse stared out the windshield, watching a squirrel navigate around a fallen branch, and tried to find words that wouldn't reveal how much this was killing him. "What do you want me to say?" he asked quietly. "I want you to tell me what you think," Elena said. "I want your honest opinion." Jesse closed his eyes briefly, then turned to look at her. She was watching him with those brown eyes that had always been able to see straight through him, and Jesse knew he had to give her the truth, even if it destroyed him. "I want what's best for you," Jesse said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. "You came here because your life fell apart, Elena. This is your chance to put it back together, better than it was before." Elena's face crumpled slightly. "Last night I told you that you make me feel like home, and now you're telling me to leave?" The pain in her voice nearly broke his resolve. "That's not what I'm saying," Jesse said carefully. "I'm saying you can't make a decision this big based on one night. You have to think about your future, your career. You have to think about what will make you happy in the long run." Elena was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting in her lap. "So you think I should take it?" "I think," Jesse said carefully, "that you're the only one who can make this decision. And I think you need to make it without worrying about how it affects anyone else." Jesse knew it was the right thing to say. But watching Elena's face crumple, seeing the hurt flash across her features before she carefully hid it, made him wonder if being noble was worth losing the woman he'd been waiting for his whole life. "Okay," Elena said finally, her voice steady but distant. "You're right. This is my decision." She got out of the truck and drove away without looking back. Jesse sat in the empty parking lot for a long time, watching the space where her car had been and wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Chapter 23. Elena sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone for what had to be the 100th time since yesterday morning. Michael's number was already pulled up, ready to call. All she had to do was press the button and tell him yes, she'd take the job, she'd be on a plane to New York tomorrow. But her finger wouldn't move. She'd spent the entire day going back and forth, making lists of pros and cons, trying to think logically about her future. The job offer was everything she'd thought she wanted. Financial security, career advancement, a chance to rebuild her professional life. It was the smart choice, the practical choice. So why did it feel so wrong? Elena walked to the living room window, looking out at the quiet street where Christmas Eve lights twinkled from the neighboring cottages. Palmar Island was peaceful in a way that New York never could be. Families were gathering for holiday dinners, and somewhere out there, Jesse was probably getting ready for whatever he'd planned as their 12th date. Except there wouldn't be a 12th date, not if she took the job. Elena closed her eyes, remembering the night at Jesse's house. The way he'd taken care of her, the peanut butter sandwiches cut exactly the way she liked them, the way he'd looked at her when she'd told him he made her feel like home, and then yesterday morning when she'd asked for his opinion and he'd essentially told her to leave. "I want what's best for you." The words had stung, but as Elena replayed the conversation in her mind, she began to see something else in Jesse's response. He hadn't told her what he wanted. He'd told her what he thought she needed to hear. Even when it was clearly killing him, he'd put her happiness above his own. That was love, wasn't it? Real love. The kind that put the other person's dreams first, even when it meant personal sacrifice. A firm knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Elena opened it to find Miss Doris standing on her porch, arms loaded with a covered basket and what appeared to be a box of Christmas decorations. "Miss Doris? What are you doing here?" "Checking on you after that terrible storm yesterday," Miss Doris said, bustling past Elena into the cottage. "I heard you and Jesse got caught in it on the nature trail. Are you all right, dear?" "I'm fine," Elena said, closing the door. "Just a twisted ankle, nothing serious." Miss Doris set her basket on the kitchen counter and turned to study Elena with those perceptive eyes. "Nonsense. You're limping. Sit down this instant." Before Elena could protest, Miss Doris was guiding her to the couch and examining her ankle with the efficiency of someone who'd raised children and grandchildren. "It's much better today," Elena insisted, though she did wince when Miss Doris gently probed the swollen area. "Still tender," Miss Doris declared. "You need to keep it elevated. And you look like you haven't eaten properly today." Elena started to protest, but Miss Doris was already unpacking her basket, revealing fresh blueberry muffins, a thermos of soup, and what looked like homemade tea cookies. Miss Doris, you didn't have to. Of course I did, Miss Doris said firmly. It's Christmas Eve, you're hurt, and you're clearly in need of some company. Now I brought decorations because this cottage is far too plain for the holidays. Meredith would be horrified if she knew you'd been staying here with barely a wreath on the door. Despite everything, Elena found herself smiling. You want to decorate? I insist on it, Miss Doris said, pulling garland and twinkling lights from her box. Christmas Eve should be magical. For the next hour, they got busy hanging garland around the windows and draping lights along the mantelpiece. The older woman kept up a steady stream of cheerful chatter, but Elena could tell she was being carefully observed. There, Miss Doris said finally, stepping back to admire their work. Much better. Now this looks like Christmas. Elena had to admit the space felt transformed. The warm lights and greenery made everything feel cozier, more festive. Thank you, Elena said. I didn't realize how much I needed this. Miss Doris settled into the armchair across from Elena, her expression growing more serious. Now then, dear, what's really troubling you? And don't tell me it's just the ankle. Elena sank back into the couch cushions, suddenly feeling exhausted. I got a job offer yesterday, in New York. Ah, Miss Doris said knowingly. And I don't know what to do, Elena admitted. It's everything I thought I wanted. Good money, career advancement, security. But, Miss Doris prompted gently. It doesn't feel right, Elena said, the words tumbling out. I keep thinking about what you said before, about some stories taking a few chapters to get right. What if this is my chance to finally get it right? Not the story I thought I was supposed to write, but the one I actually want to live. Miss Doris leaned forward, her eyes warm with understanding. And what story is that, dear? The one where I'm brave enough to choose love over security, Elena said, the words feeling right as soon as she spoke them. The one where I stop running towards something that looks perfect on paper and start appreciating what's actually perfect for me. That sounds like a very good story indeed, Miss Doris said softly. Elena pulled out her phone and dialed Michael's number before she could lose her nerve. Michael, it's Elena, she said when he answered. I've made my decision. I'm flattered by the offer, but I can't take it. I'm staying in South Carolina. The conversation was brief. Michael was disappointed but understanding, and he wished her well. When Elena hung up, she felt lighter than she had in months. Well, Miss Doris said, beaming, that's settled then. You've chosen your story. Chapter 24. Jesse pulled into Elena's driveway just as Miss Doris was coming down the front steps, her empty basket tucked under one arm and a satisfied smile on her face. She waved cheerfully as she passed his truck, her eyes twinkling with that knowing look she got when she was particularly pleased with herself. Perfect timing, dear, Miss Doris called through his open window. Elena's inside, and the place looks absolutely lovely now. Very festive. Jesse nodded, managing a smile despite the heaviness in his chest. Thanks for checking on her. Oh, it was my pleasure, Miss Doris said, then leaned closer to the truck window. Jesse, sometimes the best gifts come in unexpected packages. Remember that. Before Jesse could ask what she meant, Miss Doris was walking away, humming a Christmas carol under her breath. Jesse sat in his truck for a moment, gathering his courage. Tonight was going to be the hardest thing he'd ever done. He was going to give Elena one perfect last memory of Palmar Island before saying goodbye. Elena opened the door before he could knock, and Jesse's breath caught. She was wearing a soft red sweater that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. The cottage behind her glowed with warm light and Christmas decorations that hadn't been there yesterday. Hi, Elena said softly, her voice carrying something Jesse couldn't quite identify. Hi, Jesse replied, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets to keep from reaching for her. Miss Doris said she helped you decorate. The place looks great. She insisted, Elena said with a small smile. You know how she is. Jesse nodded, then took a deep breath. Are you up for one more adventure? Our 12th date? Elena's expression flickered with something that might have been sadness. Jesse, you don't have to. I want to, Jesse interrupted gently. It's Christmas Eve. Humor me? Elena studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Okay, let me get my coat. The drive to the beach was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Jesse had chosen a secluded stretch of sand on the island's north side, away from the holiday celebrations happening in town. As they walked over the dunes, Elena gasped. Jesse had spent most of the afternoon creating something magical. A small evergreen tree, barely 4 feet tall, stood at the edge of the dunes where the sand met the seagrass. He decorated it with shells and pieces of sea glass that caught the moonlight, small driftwood ornaments he'd carved, and strings of battery-powered LED lights that twinkled like stars. A bonfire was set up nearby, surrounded by blankets and pillows, with a large cooler tucked discreetly to one side. "Jesse," Elena breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "This is beautiful." "Sit," Jesse said, guiding her to the blankets before lighting the firewood. "I brought dinner." He opened the cooler and began unpacking containers from Mary's diner. It wasn't your typical holiday fare, but he had a feeling she wouldn't mind. The last thing he pulled out were 2 slices of Mary's famous peanut butter pie. "You remembered," Elena said softly, watching him arrange patty melts and sides between them. "I remember everything about you," Jesse said, settling onto the blanket beside her. "The way you always saved the sweet potato fries for last because they were your favorite part. How you'd ask for extra cheese in your patty melt. The way your eyes light up when you see peanut butter pie." Elena was quiet, staring at the food spread between them. In the glow of the bonfire and Christmas lights, Jessie could see tears gathering in her eyes. "This is incredible," she said finally. "All of it. The tree, the dinner, this whole setup. It's like something out of a romance novel." Jessie felt his chest tighten. "I wanted to give you something to remember. One perfect Christmas Eve on Palmar Island." They ate slowly, talking quietly about childhood memories and Christmases past. Jesse found himself memorizing everything, the way the firelight danced across Elena's face, how she laughed at his stories, the comfortable silence that fell between them as they watched the waves crash against the shore. When they'd finished eating, Jesse reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I made this for you," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "Something to take with you." Elena unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small painting of Palmar Island, complete with tiny details. The lighthouse, the harbor, even her aunt's house. He'd signed it in tiny script in the bottom right corner. "Jesse," Elena whispered, turning the ornament over in her hands. "This is beautiful. It must have taken you hours." "I wanted you to have something that would remind you of this place," Jesse said. "Of us. Of these 12 dates." Elena looked up at him, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Jesse, let me say this," Jesse interrupted gently. "Please, I need to say it." Elena nodded, clutching the piece of art against her chest. Jesse took a deep breath, staring out at the dark ocean before turning back to her. "I've been in love with you since we were 16 years old, Elena. Maybe longer. When you left for college, I told myself I'd missed my chance. When you built a life in New York, I convinced myself you were better off without me. But these past few weeks, having you back here, getting to fall in love with you all over again, it's been the best time of my life." "Jesse," Elena said, her voice breaking. "I know you have to go," Jesse continued. "I know the job in New York is everything you've worked for, everything you deserve. And I want you to know that I'm proud of you for taking it. You're going to do amazing things, Elena. You're going to be so happy." Elena was crying in earnest now, but Jesse forced himself to continue. "These 12 dates were supposed to prove that love exists," Jesse said, his voice growing rough with emotion. "But the truth is, I didn't need to prove it to you." Going rough with emotion. "But the truth is, I didn't need to prove it to you. I needed to prove it to myself. I needed to believe that what I felt for you was real, that it was worth fighting for, even if I couldn't win. And now I know it is. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life, Elena Hart, even if this is goodbye." Jesse reached out and gently wiped a tear from Elena's cheek. "So thank you for coming back, for giving me these weeks, for letting me love you, even if it's just for a little while." Elena caught his hand against her face, her brown eyes blazing with something fierce and determined. "You don't have to prove it anymore," she said, her voice strong despite the tears. "I've always felt it. I just had to be brave enough to believe it." Jesse's heart stopped. "I'm not taking the job," Elena said, the words rushing out. "I called Michael this afternoon and turned it down. I'm staying, Jesse. I'm staying on Palmar Island. I'm staying with you." Jesse stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he'd heard. "You are?" "I'm staying," Elena confirmed, laughing through her tears. "I'm done running away from the best thing that's ever happened to me. I love you, Jesse Winslow. I think I've loved you since we were kids building sandcastles and planning adventures. I was just too scared and too stubborn to see it." Jesse felt like his heart might burst. "Are you sure? The job, the money, your career will figure itself out," Elena interrupted, moving closer to him on the blanket. "But this? Us? This is once in a lifetime. This is real. and I'm not letting it go again." Jesse reached for her then, pulling her into his arms as the Christmas lights twinkled overhead and the ocean sang its ancient song beside them. When he kissed her, it tasted like peanut butter pie and salt air and coming home. It felt like every Christmas wish he'd ever made finally coming true. When they finally broke apart, Elena rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing unsteadily. "So," Elena said, her voice soft and teasing, "how was that for a 12th date?" Jesse laughed, the sound rich and full of joy. "Best one yet," he said, pulling her closer. "Though I have to warn you, I'm hoping for a lot more dates in our future." "I'm counting on it," Elena said, settling into his arms as they watched the Christmas lights reflect off the dark water. "Merry Christmas, Jesse." "Merry Christmas, Ellie." Above them, the stars shone bright over Palmar Island, and for the first time in either of their lives, everything felt exactly as it should be. Epilogue. Palmar Island, 1 year later. Elena adjusted the strap of her camera bag as she and Jesse walked hand in hand through the Palmar Island Christmas market, the familiar sights and sounds wrapping around her like a warm embrace. The same twinkling lights crisscrossed overhead, the same vendors sold hot cider and kettle corn, and the same sense of magic filled the crisp December air. But everything else had changed in the most wonderful way. "Hold still," Elena said, stopping to snap a photo of a family gathered around the snow globe station. "This is perfect for the tourism board's holiday campaign." Jesse watched her work with that soft smile she'd grown to love, the one that said he was proud of her and amazed by her all at once. Elena's small creative agency had taken off faster than she'd ever imagined possible. Working with local businesses, the tourism board, and even some mainland clients who appreciated her authentic, story-driven approach to marketing, she'd built a thriving business that felt both meaningful and sustainable right here on Palmar Island. "You look happy," Jesse said as she tucked her camera back into its bag. "I am happy," Elena replied, smiling. The truth was, she felt radiant with contentment. This past year had been everything she'd dreamed of, but never dared to hope for. Every morning she woke up in the house she was renting from her aunt, taking her coffee out to the front porch to watch the island come to life. And she was building a business that let her tell the stories of people and places she'd grown to love was better than any fairy tale. "Elena, Jesse." Miss Doris's voice carried across the crowd, and they turned to see the older woman waving from the bake sale booth, her face bright with the kind of joy that came from seeing her matchmaking efforts come to fruition. "We should go say hello," Elena said, tugging Jesse in Miss Doris's direction. "In a minute," Jesse said, his voice slightly strange. "There's something I want to show you first." Elena looked at him curiously, noting the nervous energy that suddenly seemed to radiate from him. "What is it?" "Come with me," Jesse said, leading her through the crowd toward the center of the market where the town's Christmas tree stood in all its glory. The tree was magnificent this year, at least 20 feet tall and covered in thousands of twinkling lights that cast dancing shadows across the cobblestones. Families gathered around its base, children pointing up at the star on top while parents snapped photos and couples stood close together in the magical glow. "It's beautiful," Elena said, tilting her head back to take in the full height of the tree. "Even more spectacular than last year." "Elena," Jesse said, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him. He was no longer standing beside her. Instead, he was down on one knee, a small velvet box open in his hands, his gray eyes shining with love and nervous excitement. Elena's breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth as the world seemed to tilt around her. "Elena Hart," Jesse said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space around them. "You came back to Palmar Island looking for a fresh start, and you gave me everything I never knew I was missing. You're my best friend, my greatest adventure, and the love of my life. Would you do me the honor of being my wife?" Elena stared down at him, at the beautiful ring sparkling in the Christmas lights, at the man who had proven that love wasn't just real. It was worth everything. Tears blurred her vision, but her heart had never been clearer. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, laughing through her tears. "Yes. Of course, yes." Jesse slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, then stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as the crowd that had gathered burst into applause and cheers. Elena could hear Miss Doris's delighted laughter above it all, could see camera phones capturing the moment, could feel the warmth and joy of an entire community celebrating with them. But all she really saw was Jesse's face, radiant with happiness as he set her back on her feet. "I love you," she said, her voice barely audible over the continued cheers around them. "I love you too," Jesse replied, cupping her face in his hands. "Always have, always will." When he kissed her under the Christmas tree, With the lights twinkling overhead and their island community cheering around them, Elena felt like every difficult day, every wrong turn, every moment of doubt had been worth it to bring her to this perfect moment. She was home. She was loved, and she was exactly where she belonged. As they broke apart, still holding each other close, Elena caught sight of Miss Doris beaming at them from across the square, her hands clasped together in obvious delight. "Think she planned this too?" Elena asked, nodding toward the older woman. Jesse followed her gaze and chuckled. "Probably, but I'm not complaining." Elena laughed, holding up her left hand to admire the ring sparkling in the Christmas lights. "Neither am I. Best 12 dates ever." "And we're just getting started," Jesse said, taking her hand as they began to walk through the crowd of well-wishers. "Wait until you see what I have planned for our honeymoon." Elena squeezed his hand, her heart full to overflowing. "Surprise me." "Always," Jesse promised, and Elena knew that whatever adventures lay ahead, they would face them together, right here on Palmar Island, where love had finally found its way home. The end. This has been The 12 Dates of Christmas, written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2025 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2025 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.